Hey there, Night Crew. Tonight we're talking about the most famous murder in human history, the kind that literally changed the entire course of Western civilization. March 15th, 44 BC, 23 stab wounds, 1 dead dictator. And the wildest part? The guys who killed Julius Caesar thought they were saving Rome. Spoiler alert, they destroyed it instead. Here's the thing nobody tells you. Caesar's assassination wasn't just some political hit job. It was a Greek tragedy written in Roman blood, where the hero's greatest strength became his fatal weakness, and the good guys turned out to be the villains of their own story. We're talking about betrayal, ambition, prophecies ignored, and a corpse that somehow ended up more powerful dead than alive. So before we dive into this absolute masterclass in how not to save a republic, go ahead and smash that like button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I love seeing who's joining me for these late-night history sessions. Now kill those lights, get comfortable, and let's unpack the greatest political miscalculation ever made. Trust me, by the end of this you'll understand why 23 stab wounds couldn't kill an idea. Ready? Let's go. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth that historians don't always love admitting. Sometimes the people who change the world don't live long enough to enjoy what they've built. And nobody embodies that particular brand of cosmic irony quite like Gaius Julius Caesar. Here's a man who conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, defeated his enemies, reformed Rome's calendar, which we still use today, unfortunately for anyone who hates Monday mornings, and became the most powerful person in the known world. His reward? Getting turned into a human pincushion by his own colleagues on a random Tuesday afternoon. Not exactly the retirement plan he had in mind. The central paradox of Caesar's story isn't just that he got murdered. Ancient Rome wasn't exactly known for its workplace safety or conflict resolution skills. The real irony runs deeper than that. Caesar's assassination happened precisely because he was too successful, too popular, too good at literally everything he attempted. Think about that for a second. In most historical narratives, leaders fall because they fail. They lose battles, bankrupt their nations, or just generally mess things up until someone with a knife collection decides it's time for new management. Caesar failed at exactly nothing that mattered. He won every military campaign. He expanded Rome's territory by roughly a third. He brought stability to a government that had been falling apart for decades. He implemented reforms that helped ordinary Romans while the Senate had been too busy arguing and collecting bribes to actually govern. And that's exactly what got him killed. See, in the twisted logic of Roman politics, being this competent wasn't inspirational, it was terrifying. The Senate looked at Caesar and didn't see a brilliant general who had just handed them the richest provinces in Europe. They saw a man who had proven the entire system obsolete. Why did Rome need a Senate full of aristocrats giving boring speeches about tradition when one guy with an army could apparently do everything better? It's the kind of question that keeps political elites awake at night, particularly when the answer is, maybe we don't. Caesar's success exposed something the Roman elite desperately wanted to keep hidden, that the Republic, that sacred institution they claimed to serve, was basically running on fumes and nostalgia by 44 BC. The machinery of government had been designed for a city-state, not a Mediterranean-spanning empire. It was like trying to run a modern corporation using the organizational chart from your local coffee shop. Sure, it worked fine when Rome controlled Italy and maybe some nearby coastline. But once you're governing everything from Spain to Syria, having 2 consuls elected annually who spent most of their time obstructing each other becomes less checks and balances and more institutionalized paralysis. The Senate meetings themselves had become exercises in performative dysfunction. Hundreds of senators would gather to debate policy, except debate is generous. It was more like competitive speech-giving where everyone tried to prove their ancestors were more noble than everyone else's ancestors, therefore their opinion on grain. Distribution should matter more. Decisions that should have taken days took months. Problems that required immediate action got buried under layers of procedural objections and appeals to tradition. And forget about actually governing the provinces. Most senators viewed their appointments as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than public service. The going rate for a provincial governorship was essentially however much you can extract from the locals without triggering a full-scale revolt. Not exactly a system designed for long-term imperial management. Meanwhile, the mechanisms that had made the Republic functional in its early days had ossified into sacred rituals that nobody could question without being accused of attacking Rome itself. The cursus honorum, that careful ladder of offices a politician was supposed to climb, had become a bottleneck that ensured only the wealthy and well-connected could ever achieve real power. The various assemblies that were supposed to represent the people had been so thoroughly corrupted by vote-buying and intimidation that election results often reflected who could afford the biggest bribes rather than any actual democratic preference. And the Senate's authority, which had once been based on genuine respect and political competence, now rested primarily on tradition and the threat of violence against anyone who challenged the system too directly. Caesar wasn't the first person to notice these problems. The Gracchi brothers had tried to reform the system 70 years earlier and got murdered for their trouble. Marius had attempted to restructure the military and found himself in a civil war. Sulla had seized dictatorial power, tried to reform the constitution, and discovered that you can't fix institutional decay by massacring your opponents and then hoping everyone forgets about it. By the time Caesar arrived on the scene, Roman politics had become a graveyard of failed reformers, and the lesson seemed clear. The system can't be fixed, so you either work within it or it destroys you. Except Caesar looked at that lesson and decided there was a third option. Make yourself so indispensable, so powerful, so successful that the system has to accommodate you whether it wants to or not. And for a while, it actually worked. Caesar's reforms were popular with ordinary Romans because they addressed real problems. His military victories brought wealth and security. His quick decision-making stood in stark contrast to the Senate's endless delays. For the first time in decades, Rome felt like it had a leader who could actually lead, rather than a committee of aristocrats who couldn't agree on what day it was without 3 weeks of debate. But here's where Caesar's tragedy becomes almost Shakespearean in its inevitability. The very qualities that made him an effective leader in the new imperial reality made him intolerable to the old republican mindset. His decisiveness looked like arrogance, his efficiency looked like contempt for proper procedures, his popularity looked like demagoguery, his reforms looked like buying support, and his unwillingness to play the traditional power-sharing games looked like tyranny. From the Senate's perspective, Caesar wasn't solving problems. He was demonstrating that their entire worldview was obsolete, which is the kind of thing people rarely forgive. The Senate hadn't actually solved a major crisis in living memory. Every time Rome faced a serious problem, a slave rebellion, a foreign invasion, political chaos, they'd essentially handed emergency powers to one strongman, let him fix it, and then pretended the whole thing never happened. This wasn't governance. It was systematic denial with occasional military dictatorship breaks. And everyone knew it, though admitting it would have required confronting some uncomfortable truths about whether your entire political system was basically cosplay for a government that stopped functioning properly around the time of the Gracchi. Brothers. Caesar was supposed to be just another temporary strongman. He'd fix the mess, restore order, then politely step aside so the Senate could go back to their usual routine of corruption and incompetence. That was the script. But Caesar looked at the script, said, "Actually, this is nonsense," and proceeded to demonstrate that Rome didn't need the Senate nearly as much as the Senate needed Rome to need the Senate, if that makes sense. Which naturally made the Senate fairly murderous. Here's where the paradox gets really twisted. The men who killed Caesar genuinely believed they were heroes. Brutus, Cassius, and their merry band of knife-wielding senators thought they were saving the Republic. They saw themselves as the last defenders of Roman virtue, standing against tyranny in its final hour. The fact that they were about to plunge Rome into another 15 years of devastating civil war that would kill hundreds of thousands of people didn't really factor into their calculations. In their minds, they were like ancient Roman Avengers, assembling to defeat the big bad villain and restore democracy. Unfortunately for everyone involved, they had catastrophically misjudged who the villain actually was. Because here's the thing, the Republic they thought they were saving. It was already dead. It had been dying for at least 50 years, maybe longer. The system of balanced power between various aristocratic families, the careful distribution of offices, the whole Senate and people of Rome arrangement, it had stopped working the moment Rome became too large and too complex for a few hundred. Wealthy men to manage through personal relationships and backroom deals. The Republic was a beautiful political philosophy that had simply outgrown its usefulness, kind of like insisting you can manage a Fortune 500 company through a group chat and good vibes. What Caesar actually represented wasn't the death of the Republic, that was happening with or without him. He represented the inevitable transition to something new, something that could actually govern an empire this size. The Senate's choice wasn't between Caesar and republican government. It was between an orderly transition to monarchy under Caesar, who at least seemed to care about not destroying everything, or a chaotic free-for-all where various military strongmen would tear the empire apart, fighting over who got to be the next. Caesar. Guess which option they chose? If you said chaotic free-for-all, congratulations, you understand Roman political logic. So when we ask whether Caesar was the victim or the architect of his own destruction, we're really asking the wrong question. It's like asking whether the last buffalo was responsible for the extinction of buffalo herds. Caesar was a symptom of systemic failure, not its cause. Could he have handled things differently? Absolutely. Could he have been less obviously monarchical, less dismissive of Senate traditions, less inclined to collect titles and honours like they were going out of style? Sure. Would it have mattered? Probably not. Because the fundamental problem wasn't Caesar's behaviour. It was that Rome had reached the point where it needed the kind of centralised authority that Caesar represented, and roughly half the elite class would rather burn the whole thing down than admit it. This is why Caesar's story resonates across centuries, why we're still talking about it 2,000 years later. It's not just about one man's assassination. It's about what happens when political systems can't adapt, when institutions become ends in themselves rather than means to governance, when the people who benefit from a failing system fight to preserve it, even as everything crumbles around them. Sound familiar? It should, because humans apparently haven't learned much about institutional reform in the last 2 millennia. The truly tragic part, and this is where the story becomes almost Shakespearean in its irony, is that the conspirators succeeded in killing Caesar, but failed at literally everything else they hoped to achieve. They wanted to restore the Republic. Instead, they guaranteed its death. They wanted to prevent monarchy. Instead, they ensured it would arrive in an even more absolute form under Augustus. They wanted to be remembered as liberators. Instead, they went down in history as the guys who murdered the most popular leader Rome had ever known, and triggered a catastrophic civil war in the process. It's possibly the most spectacular own goal in political history, and that's a category with some serious competition. And Caesar himself, he ended up more powerful dead than alive. They killed the man but created the myth. Within months, his adopted heir was calling himself son of the divine Julius. Within decades, every Roman emperor would claim descent from him, regardless of actual biology. Within centuries, his name would become synonymous with absolute power in multiple languages. Kaiser, Tsar, all variations on Caesar. The Senate tried to erase him and instead made him immortal. Somewhere in the underworld, Caesar was probably laughing, though given that he took 23 stab wounds to get there, perhaps laughing is generous. This brings us to the central question that makes Caesar's assassination more than just another political murder in a city that saw plenty of them. Was Caesar building something new that Rome needed, or was he destroying something valuable that could have survived? Were the conspirators deluded assassins or the last patriots of a dying republic? And most importantly, does it even matter? Because regardless of intentions on either side, the result was the same: the death of one political system and the birth of another, written in blood on the floor of Pompey's theatre. These aren't just academic questions for historians to debate in university seminars. They're questions about power, about institutional change, about when reform becomes revolution, and when defending tradition becomes obstruction. They're questions that keep coming up throughout history, wearing different costumes but playing out the same fundamental drama. Which is why we're going to spend the next several hours unpacking every detail of how the most successful leader of the ancient world ended up bleeding out on a Senate floor while his murderers literally stood over his body and called themselves liberators. But before we get to the stabbing, and trust me, we'll get to the stabbing in excruciating detail, we need to understand how Caesar accumulated the kind of power that made the Senate collectively decide murder was the only remaining option. We need to understand why his soldiers loved him more than they loved Rome itself. We need to understand how he turned popular support into a weapon more dangerous than all his legions combined. Because Caesar didn't just stumble into absolute power through luck or inheritance. He built it piece by piece, reform by reform, victory by victory, until he had constructed something the Republic couldn't tolerate and couldn't destroy. That's what makes his assassination inevitable and tragic in equal measure. By the time the conspirators started sharpening their knives, There was no path back to the old Republic, no matter how many times they invoked the ghosts of Brutus the Elder or other ancient Roman heroes. The only questions left were how Caesar would fall and what would rise from the ashes. And those questions were about to be answered in blood. Now, if you want to understand why roughly 60 senators decided they needed to turn Caesar into a human sacrifice, you have to start with his army. Not because the army killed him. They weren't even in the room when it happened, which was kind of the whole point of holding the assassination in a Senate meeting. But because the army was the foundation of everything Caesar built, and more importantly, it was the thing that made him absolutely terrifying to the traditional power structure of Rome. Let's establish some context here. In the Roman Republic, military command was supposed to be temporary. You got appointed to lead some legions, you conquered whatever barbarians needed conquering, you came home, disbanded your army, celebrated with a parade, and went back to being a regular senator who argued about grain subsidies and complained about the younger generation's moral decay. That was the system. Military power was explicitly separate from political power, and generals were expected to treat their armies like rental cars, use them for the assigned purpose, then return them without getting too attached. Caesar looked at this system and basically said, "Yeah, that's adorable, but I'm going to do something completely different." What he did, over the course of about 10 years in Gaul, was transform his legions from a temporarily assigned military force into a personal instrument of power that was loyal to him first, Rome second, and the Senate maybe third if they were having a particularly patriotic day. This wasn't technically illegal, but it was definitely frowned upon, kind of like how eating pizza with a fork isn't against the law, but makes everyone question your life choices. The genius of what Caesar did wasn't just winning battles. Plenty of Roman generals won battles. It was how he fundamentally restructured the relationship between commander and soldier in a way that made his army an extension of his political will. He turned military service from a civic duty into a personal contract between himself and his men. And once he did that, he had something no one else in Rome possessed. Tens of thousands of extremely capable soldiers who would follow him literally anywhere, including into Rome itself if necessary. So how did he do it? How did Caesar take a standard Roman army and turn it into what was essentially the ancient world's first cult of personality on legs? Well, it started with money, because it always starts with money. Roman soldiers in Caesar's time weren't particularly well paid by modern standards. Actually, they weren't particularly well paid by ancient standards either. A legionnaire's salary was enough to survive on, maybe enough to save up for a small plot of land if you didn't get killed first, but it wasn't making anyone wealthy. The real money in Roman military service came from two sources: plunder during campaigns and land grants after retirement. And Caesar understood that controlling these resources meant controlling his soldiers' futures, which meant controlling his soldiers. When Caesar's legions conquered a Gallic village, the distribution of loot wasn't handled by some bureaucratic system back in Rome. Caesar personally oversaw it. He made sure every soldier, from the lowest-ranking grunt to his senior officers, got a share that felt generous. More importantly, he made sure they knew it came from him. Not from the Senate, not from the glory of Rome, but from Caesar himself, who had led them to victory and was now rewarding their loyalty. This is basic psychological manipulation, and it worked beautifully. After a while, his soldiers didn't see themselves as serving Rome. They saw themselves as serving Caesar, who happened to be working for Rome. Subtle difference, massive implications. But Caesar didn't just throw money at his troops and call it a day. He was smarter than that. He also made them feel special, which turns out to be even more powerful than wealth when it comes to building loyalty. Caesar had this habit of learning his soldiers' names. Not just the officers, that's normal. He supposedly knew hundreds of regular legionnaires by name. Imagine being a random soldier from some small town in Italy, and the most famous general in the Roman world walks past you on inspection and says, "Hey Marcus, how's that leg wound healing up?" That kind of personal attention builds devotion that money can't buy. It makes soldiers feel seen, valued, like they matter to the great man himself. This wasn't some random act of kindness either. It was calculated psychology that Caesar applied systematically throughout his command. He'd walk through camp and remember details about individual soldiers' families, their hometowns, their previous battles. He'd ask about a soldier's brother who had been injured in the last campaign, or comment on how someone's new armor looked good. These tiny moments of recognition created bonds that went far beyond the normal military hierarchy. Roman generals were supposed to maintain distance from their troops, to rule through authority and fear. Caesar ruled through something much more dangerous, genuine personal connection, or at least the convincing illusion of it. The result was that Caesar's soldiers would do things for him that they'd never do for an ordinary general. They'd march longer, fight harder, endure worse conditions, all because they believed Caesar personally cared about them. And maybe he did, in his way. Or maybe he just understood that humans will do extraordinary things for leaders who make them feel valued. Either way, the effect was the same. Legions that would follow him into situations that should have been suicide missions and somehow come out victorious because they refused to let Caesar down. Caesar also had this remarkable ability to turn near disasters into bonding experiences. When his army ran short on supplies during the Gallic campaigns, which happened fairly regularly because supplying tens of thousands of soldiers hundreds of miles from home isn't exactly simple, Caesar would give speeches about how they were all suffering together, how real Roman soldiers could endure anything, how this hardship would make them stronger than any army in the world. And somehow his men would buy into it. They'd eat bark and grass and convince themselves they were becoming elite warriors through shared suffering. This is cult leader psychology, except Caesar was applying it to one of the most effective military forces in human history. There's this famous story, possibly apocryphal, but too good not to mention, about a time when Caesar's soldiers were complaining about conditions during a particularly difficult campaign. Caesar supposedly gathered them together and gave a speech where he offered to release any soldier who wanted to leave. No punishment, no shame. Just walk away if you can't handle it. Not a single soldier took him up on the offer. Whether this actually happened or was propaganda Caesar spread about himself later, the point is that it was believable. His men would have rather died than abandon him, which is exactly the kind of loyalty that can't be bought or forced. It has to be cultivated through years of strategic relationship building. And it wasn't just hollow flattery. Caesar made a point of sharing his soldiers' hardships, at least symbolically. When the army was on a difficult march, Caesar would sometimes walk instead of riding. When supplies were short, he'd make sure everyone saw him eating the same rations as the common soldiers. Was this genuine solidarity or calculated political theatre? Probably both, but the effect was the same. His men believed Caesar was one of them, just a better-dressed version who happened to be an exceptional military genius. This is Leadership 101, but nobody before Caesar had applied it quite so systematically in a military context. Then there was the military innovation itself. See, Caesar wasn't just a great general because he won battles. Lots of generals won battles. Caesar was revolutionary because he fundamentally understood that warfare wasn't just about tactics. It was about psychology, logistics, and adaptation. His approach to military campaigns was almost scientific in its precision, which was deeply unusual for an era when most generals relied on charge forward with great courage and hope for the best. Take his bridge over the Rhine, for example. The German tribes lived on the far side of this massive river, and they'd been raiding Roman territory knowing the Rhine provided natural protection. Most generals would have either given up or spent months building boats. Caesar looked at the situation and decided to build a bridge. Not a small bridge, a massive military bridge constructed in something like 10 days, which allowed his legions to march across in full formation, terrify the Germans into submission, and then march back before destroying the bridge. The message was clear. Geographical barriers meant nothing to Caesar's legions. If he wanted to reach you, he'd simply build whatever infrastructure was necessary to make it happen. The engineering required for this bridge was actually insane by ancient standards. We're talking about driving massive wooden piles into a riverbed, constructing supports that could handle the weight of thousands of armoured soldiers, all while the current was trying to wash everything away. Caesar's engineers, and he had the best engineers in the Roman world, accomplished in days what should have taken months, and the psychological effect on both his soldiers and his enemies was enormous. His men started believing that nothing was impossible if Caesar commanded it. His enemies started wondering if they were fighting against a mortal general or some kind of demigod who could reshape geography at will. This kind of engineering prowess became a Caesar signature. During the siege of Avaricum, he built siege towers that were taller than the city walls, essentially constructing mobile skyscrapers that his soldiers could use to shoot down into the city. At Alesia, which we'll get to, he built fortifications that were so extensive they're still studied in military academies today. Every major engagement saw Caesar pulling out some new innovation that made his opponents realize they weren't just fighting an army, They were fighting an opponent who could literally change the rules of engagement through engineering and logistics. But it wasn't just about building impressive structures. Caesar also revolutionized how Roman armies moved and fought. Traditional Roman tactics were fairly straightforward. Form up in your standard formation, march toward the enemy, crash into them, and hopefully win through superior discipline and equipment. Caesar kept the discipline and equipment but added flexibility and speed that Roman armies had never possessed before. His famous forced marches became legendary. A normal Roman legion might cover 15 miles in a day if they were pushing hard. Caesar's legions would sometimes march 40 or 50 miles in a day, arriving at battlefields before the enemy even knew they were in the region. This wasn't just physically demanding, it was psychologically devastating to opponents who thought they had days to prepare and suddenly found Caesar's legions on their doorstep. The element of surprise became Caesar's weapon, and he wielded it ruthlessly. He also pioneered flexible tactics that allowed his legions to adapt mid-battle, rather than just executing a pre-planned formation. Most Roman generals would array their troops at the start of battle, and then basically hope everything went according to plan. Caesar treated battles like living, evolving situations where he could respond to changing conditions in real time. He'd shift cohorts from one part of the line to another, create reserves that could plug gaps, split his forces to attack from multiple directions. His battles read like chess matches where he was always 3 moves ahead of his opponents. The Battle of Pharsalus, where Caesar defeated Pompey during the Civil War, is a perfect example. Pompey had more soldiers, better positioning, and cavalry superiority. By all conventional military logic, he should have won. Caesar looked at Pompey's cavalry advantage and created a special 4th line of infantry, specifically trained to counter horsemen, something Roman armies didn't typically do. When Pompey's cavalry charged, expecting to overwhelm Caesar's flank, they ran into a wall of infantry specifically prepared for them. The psychological shock of having your supposedly unbeatable cavalry routed by infantry was enough to collapse Pompey's entire position. Caesar won because he'd anticipated his opponent's strategy and prepared a counter that nobody saw coming. This kind of creative problem-solving became Caesar's signature. Other generals worked within limitations. Caesar redefined what was possible. He built siege works that were marvels of engineering. He forced marches at speeds that seemed impossible for armies carrying full equipment. He invented tactics on the fly to counter specific enemies. And every time he pulled off something that seemed impossible, his soldiers' faith in him grew stronger. After a while, his men genuinely believed that Caesar couldn't lose, which is a massive psychological advantage when you're marching into battle. If your soldiers think victory is inevitable because their general is just that good, they fight with a confidence that becomes self-fulfilling. But here's where it gets really interesting. Caesar didn't just make his soldiers loyal through money and competence, he also made them complicit in his political ambitions. By the time Caesar decided to cross the Rubicon and march on Rome, his soldiers weren't just following orders, they were active participants in what was essentially a coup against the Roman government. And they did it willingly, eagerly even, because Caesar had spent 10 years making sure their interests aligned with his. Think about what that means for a moment. The Roman Republic's entire political system was built on the assumption that armies served Rome, not individual generals. The idea was that soldiers were citizens first, soldiers second, and they'd never follow a general into civil war against their own government. Caesar shattered that assumption completely. When he stood at the Rubicon and said, "The die is cast," his legions didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't consider that they were committing treason against the Republic. They followed Caesar because, from their perspective, Caesar was their government. He was the one who paid them, promoted them, made them wealthy, and gave their lives meaning beyond just stand in formation and stab barbarians. This is what kept the Senate up at night. They could see what Caesar had created, a military force that was personally loyal to one man and could be turned against Rome itself if that man chose to do so. And Caesar had proven he would absolutely do that when he crossed the Rubicon. The precedent was set. Roman armies could be used as political weapons against Rome itself. That was supposed to be impossible, but Caesar had made it real. Now let's talk about the Gallic campaigns themselves, because this is where Caesar built his legend. For almost 10 years, from 58 to 50 BC, Caesar fought in Gaul, what we'd now call France, Belgium, parts of Germany, and a bit of England, because apparently Caesar saw the ocean and thought, you know what? I bet there's land on the other side I could conquer too. And he did. He actually invaded Britain, which didn't accomplish much militarily but was fantastic propaganda. Romans back home were like, wait, he went where? There's land beyond the ocean. And he conquered it? Is he even human? The scale of the Gallic Wars is hard to overstate. Ancient sources claim something like 1 million Gauls died during these campaigns, with another million enslaved. Those numbers are probably exaggerated. Ancient historians had a tendency to add zeros when describing enemy casualties, but even if we cut them in half, we're talking about one of the deadliest military campaigns in ancient history. Caesar essentially depopulated entire regions of Gaul, destroyed cultures that had existed for centuries, and brought all that territory under Roman control. From a modern perspective, this is horrifying. From a Roman perspective, this was exactly what a great general was supposed to do, except Caesar did it bigger, faster, and more completely than anyone else. And the whole time, Caesar was writing about it. His commentaries on the Gallic War were ostensibly just military reports, the kind of thing generals filed with the Senate to keep them informed about campaign progress. Except Caesar's reports were beautifully written propaganda pieces that made him sound like a combination of Alexander the Great and a character from an action movie. He wrote about himself in the third person. Caesar did this, Caesar did that, which should have been insufferably pretentious but somehow worked. These reports were copied and distributed throughout Rome, where people read them like we'd binge-watch a prestige TV series today. Caesar was fighting barbarians on the frontier and simultaneously winning the propaganda war back home, which is the kind of multitasking that made his enemies deeply nervous. His military tactics during these campaigns became legendary. At Alesia, when he was besieging a massive Gallic fortress while simultaneously being surrounded by a relief army, Caesar built 2 walls, one facing inward to contain the besieged Gauls, one facing outward to hold off the relieving force. He was essentially fighting in 2 directions at once, which is the kind of absurd military challenge that should result in total disaster. Instead, Caesar won decisively, destroyed the Gallic resistance, and cemented his reputation as possibly the greatest tactical mind since Alexander. His soldiers watched him pull off victories that seemed impossible, which reinforced their belief that Caesar was operating on a different level than normal generals. The psychological impact of these campaigns on his legions can't be overstated. These men had marched from Italy to the Atlantic Ocean and back. They'd crossed rivers that were supposed to be uncrossable, built bridges and fortifications that were considered engineering miracles, defeated armies that outnumbered them, conquered lands their parents had never even heard of. And they'd done it all following one man, Caesar. They'd seen him make decisions in the middle of battle that seemed insane but worked perfectly. They'd watched him turn disaster into victory so many times it stopped seeming like luck and started seeming like divine favour. By the time the Gallic Wars ended, Caesar's legions weren't just an army. They were a military-religious movement with Caesar as their prophet. The normal Roman relationship between general and soldier had been completely inverted. Usually soldiers served Rome and the general was just the guy pointing them in the right direction. But Caesar's soldiers served Caesar, and Rome was just the entity that happened to employ them both. This distinction mattered enormously when Caesar decided to start a civil war. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC with just 1 legion, the famous 13th, he was essentially betting everything that his soldiers would follow him into treason. And they did. Not reluctantly, not because they were forced, but eagerly. They followed him because he'd spent 10 years building a relationship where their success was his success. Their wealth was tied to his power. Their identities were wrapped up in being Caesar's legions. The Senate had feared this exact scenario, and their worst nightmare was coming true. The civil war that followed showed just how thoroughly Caesar had transformed military loyalty in Rome. His legions fought against other Roman legions, soldiers killing soldiers who had been their comrades, all because they were loyal to different generals. This was supposed to be impossible in the Republic. Armies were supposed to serve Rome, not compete with each other based on their commanders' political ambitions. But Caesar had proven that personal loyalty could trump civic duty, that soldiers could be made to care more about their general than their country. And Caesar's soldiers didn't just fight for him, they fought brilliantly. They executed complex maneuvers with precision. They adapted to whatever enemies they faced. They maintained discipline even when outnumbered. Because Caesar had trained them not just to follow orders, but to trust in his leadership completely. When Caesar said, "We're going to march 50 miles in 24 hours and surprise the enemy at dawn," His soldiers didn't question whether it was possible. They just did it, because if Caesar said it was possible, it must be. This is what made Caesar so terrifying to the Senate. It wasn't just that he had an army. Lots of people had armies. It was that he had an army that would do absolutely anything he commanded, that saw him as almost divine in his abilities, that would follow him against Rome itself without hesitation. That kind of power had no place in a republic. It was the power of a king, maybe even the power of a god, and Caesar wielded it with a casual confidence that suggested he knew exactly how unprecedented and dangerous it was. The Senate's response was predictable. Demand that Caesar disband his legions before returning to Rome. Caesar's response was equally predictable. Absolutely not. He knew that without his army he was just another politician who could be prosecuted, exiled, or assassinated. With his army he was untouchable. This standoff was inevitable given everything Caesar had built. You don't spend 10 years creating a military machine personally loyal to you, and then voluntarily give it up because some senators ask politely. So when we talk about Caesar's assassination, we have to understand that killing Caesar wasn't just about eliminating one man. It was about destroying the model he'd created. The idea that a general could build an army so loyal to him personally that it became an independent power base capable of overthrowing the government. The conspirators weren't just killing Caesar. They were trying to kill the concept of Caesarism itself, the notion that military power and personal charisma could override all the careful constitutional protections that were supposed to prevent tyranny. Unfortunately for them, you can kill a man much easier than you can kill an idea, and by the time they murdered Caesar, he'd already proven that his model worked. He'd shown that a sufficiently capable and popular general could build a military force loyal enough to seize control of Rome. That lesson didn't die with him on the Senate floor. It was learned by every ambitious Roman general who came after, most notably by Caesar's adopted heir, who would use Caesar's exact playbook to establish the empire. The really twisted irony: Caesar's veterans, those soldiers who had followed him through Gaul, across the Rubicon, and through the Civil War, they were still around after his death. They were still armed. They were still organized. And they were absolutely furious that someone had murdered their beloved general. Mark Antony understood this immediately. So did Octavian. The conspirators apparently didn't, which is mind-boggling given that they'd just killed a man whose primary power base was the undying loyalty of tens of thousands of trained killers. When the mob started rioting after Caesar's funeral, when Antony turned public opinion against the conspirators, when Octavian started raising armies using Caesar's name and wealth, all of this was possible because Caesar had built a military machine that outlived him. His soldiers didn't stop being loyal just because their general was dead. If anything, they became more devoted to his memory, more determined to avenge him, more willing to follow anyone who claimed to be continuing Caesar's legacy. This is the ultimate expression of what Caesar created. He didn't just build an army, he built a system where military loyalty could be transferred, inherited, used as political capital. Augustus would take this system and perfect it, creating the permanent standing legions of the empire, each one sworn to personal loyalty to the emperor. The Praetorian Guard, that eventually ended up killing more emperors than it protected, was essentially Caesar's model taken to its logical conclusion, a military force whose primary loyalty was to their commander as a person, not to the state as an institution. The Senate had wanted to prevent exactly this. They'd spent centuries trying to keep military power separate from political power, trying to ensure that generals couldn't use their armies as personal weapons. Caesar shattered that separation so thoroughly that it could never be repaired. After him, whoever controlled the armies controlled Rome. The Republic was dead the moment Caesar crossed the Rubicon, even if it took another 15 years of civil war for everyone to accept it. So when those 60 senators started planning their assassination, they were trying to solve an unsolvable problem. How do you kill a man whose real power doesn't come from his physical presence, but from the loyalty of thousands of soldiers who aren't even in the same city? How do you destroy a system of personal military devotion that's already spread throughout the Roman world? The answer, as they would discover too late, is that you can't. You can stick a knife in the man, but the machine he built keeps running without him. So Caesar had his invincible military machine and his legions of devoted soldiers. Great. But here's the thing about ancient Rome. You couldn't rule by military force alone, not for long anyway. You needed popular support from the people, And more importantly, you needed to make sure the people liked you more than they liked the senators who wanted you dead. And this is where Caesar became truly dangerous to the Roman establishment, because he figured out how to turn economic policy into a weapon more powerful than any legion. Let's talk about money, because that's what this really comes down to. The Roman economy by the 1st century BC was an absolute mess, though the Senate would have strongly objected to this characterization. From their perspective, everything was working perfectly fine. Sure, a handful of families controlled most of the wealth, while the majority of Roman citizens lived in varying degrees of poverty, but that's just how things were supposed to work. The aristocracy owned massive estates, held all the important government positions, collected taxes from the provinces, and generally lived like they were competing in some kind of wealth accumulation Olympics. Meanwhile, regular Romans, the plebeians, were struggling with debt, losing their small farms to wealthy landowners, and watching as opportunities for economic advancement disappeared faster than free bread at a public distribution. The debt situation alone was catastrophic. Roman society ran on credit in a way that would make modern credit card companies proud, except without any of the consumer protections or reasonable interest rates. If you were a small farmer and had a bad harvest, you'd borrow money to make it through the season. Except the interest rates were absolutely brutal. We're talking anywhere from 12 to 48% annually, which is what we'd now call predatory lending, but the Romans just called business. And if you couldn't pay back your loan, well, you could be sold into debt slavery, which is exactly as pleasant as it sounds. Your creditor literally owned you until you worked off what you owed, assuming you lived long enough to do so. This system worked great for the wealthy. They made massive profits from lending money and ended up owning more land when debtors defaulted. It worked less well for everyone else, which is to say, it was slowly destroying the Roman middle class. Small farmers, who had once formed the backbone of both the Roman economy and the Roman army, were being squeezed out of existence. They'd lose their land, move to Rome looking for work, and end up in massive apartment buildings that were essentially ancient Roman tenements, where the rent was too high, the buildings were fire hazards, and the sewage situation was best not thought about too deeply. The Senate's response to this growing crisis was essentially, have you tried being born into a wealthy family? They'd occasionally pass some minor reforms when the mob got too angry, but nothing that would actually threaten their economic interests. Real land reform, real debt relief, real economic restructuring, that was off the table, because all of those solutions would cost the aristocracy money and power. Better to just maintain the status quo and hope the plebeians stayed too poor and disorganized to cause serious trouble. Enter Caesar, who looked at this situation and saw not a humanitarian crisis but an opportunity. Because here's what Caesar understood that most Roman politicians didn't. Economic grievances are political weapons if you know how to use them. All those indebted farmers, all those unemployed workers, all those struggling families, they represented potential support if someone actually addressed their problems. Or even if someone just pretended to care about their problems, which is sometimes enough in politics. Caesar's economic program was actually brilliant in its populist appeal. He started with debt relief, which sounds charitable until you realize it was also a calculated move to create a massive base of grateful supporters. In 49 BC, as part of his civil war legislation, Caesar essentially forgave a quarter of all outstanding debts, just cancelled them. If you owed money, congratulations, you now owed 25% less. For people who had been drowning in debt for years, this was like winning the lottery, assuming lotteries existed in ancient Rome, which they didn't because even the Romans had some standards. The wealthy, naturally, were absolutely furious. Caesar had just cost them enormous amounts of money with a simple legislative decree. Their carefully accumulated portfolios of debt obligations, which were essentially investments that generated steady income through interest, had been partially wiped out. This is like if the government suddenly announced that everyone's mortgage was now 75% of what it used to be. Great for homeowners, less great for banks. Except in ancient Rome, the senators were the banks, so they took this very personally. But Caesar wasn't done. He also instituted rent relief, suspending rent payments for a year up to a certain amount. So if you were renting one of those terrible Roman apartments, you suddenly didn't have to pay rent for 12 months. The landlords, again, mostly wealthy senators and aristocrats, were apoplectic. Not only had Caesar reduced their income from debt obligations, now he was also cutting their rental income. From the Senate's perspective, this was basically theft. From the perspective of struggling Romans, this was the first time in their lives anyone in power had actually helped them, instead of just giving speeches about Roman virtue and hard work. Then there was land reform, which was even more controversial because it involved actual redistribution of property. Caesar took land from the state holdings, territories that Rome had conquered but that were technically public property, though in practice they'd been absorbed by wealthy families who treated them as private estates and redistributed it to his. Veterans and to landless plebeians. He founded colonies throughout Italy and the provinces, settling around 80,000 Roman citizens on land that gave them a chance to actually become economically self-sufficient. This was populism in its purest form. Caesar was taking from the wealthy elite and giving to ordinary Romans, and he was doing it on a scale that Rome hadn't seen in generations. The people loved him for it. The Senate hated him for it. And both sides had perfectly rational reasons for their reactions. If you were a struggling plebeian, Caesar looked like the first politician in living memory who actually cared whether you could feed your family. If you were a senator watching your economic interests get dismantled piece by piece, Caesar looked like a dangerous radical who was undermining the entire foundation of a Roman society, which from their perspective was exactly what he was doing. But Caesar's economic populism went beyond just direct redistribution. He also understood the power of public entertainment as a political tool. The Romans had this concept called bread and circuses, the idea that if you keep the population fed and entertained, they won't cause problems. Caesar took this to unprecedented levels. He sponsored gladiatorial games on a scale that made previous spectacles look like amateur productions. We're talking hundreds of gladiators, exotic animals from Africa, elaborate stage productions, naval battles in flooded arenas. These weren't just entertainment, they were political statements. Caesar was showing the people that he could give them things the Senate never would. The grain dole is another perfect example. Rome had a system of free grain distribution for poor citizens, which was essential because unemployment was rampant and bread riots are never good for political stability. But the system was inefficient, corrupt, and inadequate. Caesar reorganized it, expanded it, and actually made sure it functioned properly. He reduced the number of recipients, cutting off those who were gaming the system, but increased the actual amounts given to those who genuinely needed it. The result was a more efficient program that cost less but helped people more, which is the kind of reform that makes regular citizens think you're competent and makes the aristocracy nervous, because it demonstrates that government can actually work, if someone competent is running it. Then there was the expansion of citizenship, which was controversial for reasons that probably seem bizarre to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense in ancient Rome. See, Roman citizenship was valuable. It came with rights, protections, and privileges. It meant you couldn't be executed without trial. You could vote in elections. You had legal protections that non-citizens didn't. The traditional view was that citizenship should be limited, exclusive, a precious thing that only certain people deserved. Expand it too much, and you diluted its value. Caesar looked at this attitude and basically said, what if we stopped being ridiculous about this? He extended citizenship to entire regions, particularly in Gaul, where he'd spent a decade conquering. Towns that supported Rome got citizenship. Veterans from auxiliary units got citizenship. Suddenly there were hundreds of thousands of new Roman citizens, which from a pragmatic perspective made perfect sense. If you're running an empire that stretches from Britain to Egypt, having more citizens means more soldiers, more taxpayers, more people with a stake in Rome's success. But from the perspective of traditional senators, this was diluting the sacred institution of Roman citizenship by giving it to barbarians and foreigners who hadn't earned it through generations of Roman ancestry. This is where the question becomes genuinely interesting. Was Caesar a true reformer who believed in helping ordinary people? Or was he a cynical manipulator who used economic policy as a tool to build political power? And the honest answer is probably yes. Both things can be true simultaneously. Caesar could genuinely believe that the Roman system needed reform, while also recognizing that reform served his political interests. He could want to help struggling farmers while also understanding that grateful farmers make loyal supporters. These motivations don't contradict each other, they reinforce each other. What's clear is that Caesar understood something fundamental about politics that the Senate either didn't understand or chose to ignore, that legitimacy comes from actually serving the people you govern, not just from holding the proper offices and following the correct procedures. The Senate had legitimacy based on tradition and institutional authority. Caesar built legitimacy based on actually solving problems and improving people's lives. And in a straight contest between those two types of authority, the Senate was terrified that tradition might lose. The economic reforms also created a nasty feedback loop for the Senate. Every time Caesar implemented a popular policy, his support among ordinary Romans grew stronger. Every time his support grew stronger, the Senate felt more threatened. Every time they felt more threatened, they opposed him more vigorously. Every time they opposed him, he pushed through more reforms to strengthen his popular support. It was a spiral that could only end in confrontation, and both sides knew it. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to say out loud. Caesar's reforms worked. Not perfectly, not without problems, but they addressed real issues that the Senate had been ignoring for decades. Debt relief actually helped struggling families. Land redistribution gave landless citizens economic opportunities. The reorganized grain dole prevented starvation. These weren't just political stunts, they were effective policies that improved people's lives, which made them even more threatening to the Senate, because they demonstrated that the traditional system wasn't just bad at governing, it was being actively beaten by one man who had decided to actually try. The Senate's counter-argument was that Caesar's methods were corrupting the Roman character. Romans were supposed to value virtue, hard work, self-sufficiency. Debt relief and land handouts and free grain encouraged dependency and laziness. By this logic, struggling farmers should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which is difficult when you don't own boots because you had to sell them to buy food, but the Senate rarely let practical concerns interfere with their philosophical positions. There's also the legitimate concern that Caesar was essentially buying support with state resources, which he absolutely was, but then again, what exactly had the Senate been doing for generations? They'd been using state resources to enrich themselves and their friends. The difference was that Caesar was distributing those resources more broadly, which made his corruption somehow more offensive than the Senate's traditional corruption, at least from the Senate's perspective. The expansion of the Senate itself was another economic political move that drove the old guard insane. Caesar increased the Senate's size from 600 members to 900. Officially, this was to make the Senate more representative of Rome's expanded empire. Unofficially, Caesar was packing the Senate with his own supporters, people who owed their positions to him and would vote accordingly. He appointed former centurions, men from the provinces, even some Gauls. The traditional aristocracy was mortified. The Senate was supposed to be exclusive, a body of Rome's finest families. Caesar was turning it into what they considered a rubber-stamp legislature full of his clients and cronies. But here's where it gets interesting. Many of the new senators Caesar appointed were actually more competent than the old aristocracy. They had real military experience, practical knowledge of administration, actual skills beyond being born into the right family. The Senate was technically being democratized, or at least expanded beyond its traditional narrow base. That this also served Caesar's political interests doesn't make it wrong, it just makes it complicated. The public works projects were another area where economics and politics merged seamlessly. Caesar initiated massive construction projects throughout Rome and Italy. New forums, new temples, infrastructure improvements, harbour development. These projects employed thousands of workers, stimulated the economy, beautified the city, and conveniently had Caesar's name attached to them. Every time a Roman used the new forum or saw the new buildings, they'd remember who built them. It's the ancient equivalent of putting your name on everything, except instead of tacky branding, you're actually improving civic infrastructure while also creating a personality cult. The Forum of Caesar, or Forum Iulium, was particularly impressive. A massive public space right in the heart of Rome featuring a temple to Venus Genitrix, the goddess from whom Caesar claimed descent. Because apparently being the most powerful person in Rome wasn't enough. You also needed to remind everyone that you were descended from gods. The Forum cost around 100 million sesterces, which is an incomprehensible amount of money but basically represented several years of Rome's entire tax revenue. Caesar financed it partly through war booty from Gaul and partly through what we'd now call creative accounting. The result was a magnificent public space that served both practical functions, law courts, markets, public meetings, and propaganda purposes. Every Roman who used the Forum was essentially walking through Caesar's monument to himself. The construction boom also had ripple effects throughout the Roman economy. All those workers needed materials: stone, wood, metal. The materials needed to be transported, which meant work for cart drivers and ship captains. The workers needed to eat, which meant business for food vendors. The whole thing stimulated economic activity in a way that benefited huge numbers of people, while also cementing Caesar's reputation as someone who got things done. Compare this to the Senate's typical approach, which involved endless debate about whether to repair a single aqueduct. And you can see why ordinary Romans preferred Caesar's method of just building things and worrying about procedural niceties. Later, the calendar reform deserves special mention because it's one of Caesar's lasting legacies that most people don't even think about. The old Roman calendar was an absolute mess. It was supposed to have 355 days, but they'd add extra months occasionally to keep it aligned with the seasons, except the process was controlled by pontifices who could manipulate it for political purposes. Elections could be delayed by adding months, magistrates could extend their terms, and the whole thing was so confused that the calendar had drifted about 3 months out of sync with the actual solar year. Farmers were planting at the wrong time according to the calendar, religious festivals were happening in the wrong seasons, and everything was generally chaotic. Caesar, with help from Alexandrian astronomers, created what we now call the Julian calendar, 365 days with a leap year every 4 years. This wasn't just administrative housekeeping, it was a demonstration that Caesar could impose order on systems that the Senate had allowed to become corrupted and dysfunctional. The fact that we still use a modified version of Caesar's calendar over 2,000 years later is a testament to how effective it was. Though it's worth noting that Caesar named the 7th month after himself, July, which is either appropriate recognition or megalomaniacal self-promotion depending on your perspective. Probably both. The integration of provincial elites into Roman society was another controversial reform. Caesar extended citizenship and senate appointments to people from conquered territories, particularly Gaul. This made practical sense. If you're governing an empire, having representatives who actually understand the regions they're administering seems reasonable. But to traditional Romans, this was horrifying. The Senate was being polluted by barbarians. Men who had been enemies of Rome just years earlier were now sitting in the most sacred legislative body in the Republic, voting on laws that affected real Romans. There's this story, possibly apocryphal, about Gallic senators arriving in Rome still wearing trousers, pants basically, which Romans considered barbarian clothing. Real Romans wore togas, which is basically a bedsheet arranged in unnecessarily complicated ways that required slaves to help you put on. The image of trouser-wearing barbarians in the Senate became a symbol of how Caesar was destroying traditional Roman culture. Never mind that many of these new senators were competent administrators with valuable experience. They wore the wrong clothes, spoke with accents, and didn't have the right ancestors, so they couldn't possibly be real senators in the eyes of the old guard. The tension between Caesar's practical competence and the Senate's devotion to tradition perfectly encapsulates why the assassination became inevitable. Caesar kept demonstrating that traditional methods were inefficient, that the old ways needed reform, that competence should matter more than ancestry. The Senate interpreted each demonstration as an attack on their legitimacy. They weren't entirely wrong. Caesar was attacking their legitimacy, just not through military force, but through the much more dangerous method of being objectively better at governing than they were. Caesar's building projects extended beyond Rome proper. He founded or refounded colonies throughout the empire. Carthage, which had been destroyed by Rome in 146 BC, was rebuilt. Corinth in Greece was re-established. New settlements sprang up in Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. Each colony was populated with Roman veterans or landless citizens, spreading Roman culture while also creating communities loyal to Caesar personally. It was imperialism and populism combined, expanding Roman power while creating economic opportunities for ordinary Romans, all while building a network of colonies that owed their existence to Caesar and could be expected to support his political interests. The veteran settlements in particular were crucial to Caesar's political coalition. These were men who had spent decades in the legions, fighting for Rome, or more accurately fighting for their generals, and they'd been promised land when they retired. Previous Roman governments had been notoriously bad at actually fulfilling these promises, leaving veterans bitter and angry. Caesar made sure his veterans got what they'd been promised, and they became one of his most reliable support bases. They had land, economic security, and reason to be grateful. They also had military training and organisation, which made them a force the Senate had to consider when contemplating how to deal with Caesar. The monetary reforms were more technical but equally significant. Caesar reorganised Rome's coinage system, standardised weights and measures, and generally brought order to an economic system that had been running on accumulated custom and regional variation. This made trade easier, reduced fraud, and helped integrate the provinces more tightly into the Roman economy. It also put Caesar's face on coins, which might seem like simple vanity, but was actually revolutionary. Roman coins had traditionally featured gods, legendary figures, or abstract symbols. Putting a living person's face on currency was an implicit claim to divine or monarchical status. Every time someone used money, they were handling Caesar's image, which is a level of propaganda saturation that modern politicians can only dream about. The question of whether this was principled reform or cynical manipulation probably bothered Caesar's enemies more than it bothered Caesar himself. From his perspective, there likely wasn't much distinction. He needed political support to survive, and helping ordinary Romans was an effective way to get it. That the policies also happened to be good policy was a fortunate coincidence. Or maybe he genuinely believed in what he was doing, and the political benefits were the fortunate coincidence. The effect was the same either way. A massive transfer of wealth and power away from the Senate and toward both Caesar personally and the broader Roman population. What's clear is that by the time of his assassination, Caesar had built an economic constituency that was larger and more devoted than any Roman politician had ever assembled. Millions of Romans, veterans with land, former debtors with relief, citizens with grain subsidies, workers with employment, provincials with citizenship, all had concrete reasons to support Caesar and oppose anyone who threatened him. This wasn't abstract political philosophy. This was people's material interests aligned with keeping Caesar in power, and that's ultimately what made the economic reforms so dangerous from the Senate's perspective. Military power could be challenged with military power. Political authority could be challenged with political maneuvering. But economic populism is almost impossible to fight when it's actually working. How do you oppose someone who's helping millions of people? The Senate's answer was to claim that Caesar was destroying traditional Roman values, undermining the Republic, creating dependency, bankrupting the state. Some of these arguments had merit, but they were also arguments that primarily appealed to people who weren't struggling with debt, who didn't need land grants, who had never worried about where their next meal was coming from. Caesar had essentially created a situation where his political survival was tied to the economic well-being of a huge portion of the Roman population. Kill Caesar, and you threatened their subsidies, their land grants, their debt relief. This should have been his insurance policy. Make yourself too valuable to too many people, and assassination becomes politically impossible. Unfortunately for Caesar, he underestimated how much the Senate was willing to risk to get rid of him. They were willing to bet that they could kill Caesar and somehow maintain control, that the mob would accept it, that the veterans would stand down, that the whole system wouldn't collapse into chaos. They were wrong, of course. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Now, you might think that Caesar's assassination was driven entirely by political, military, and economic factors, and you'd mostly be right. But there was another element that doesn't get as much attention in the typical narrative, and that's the role of women in Caesar's life and how those relationships were weaponized by his enemies. Because in ancient Rome, a man's relationship with women wasn't just personal, it was political. And Caesar's complicated romantic and political entanglements with powerful women gave his enemies additional ammunition for the propaganda war against him. Let's start with Calpurnia, because she's the one who tried to save his life and got completely ignored for her trouble. Calpurnia was Caesar's fourth wife, married to him around 59 BC, when Caesar was already a major political figure. By Roman standards, this was an unremarkable political marriage. Calpurnia came from a respectable family, brought useful political connections, and performed her duties as a Roman wife appropriately. She stayed in the background, managed the household, didn't cause scandals, exactly what a proper Roman matron was supposed to do. But on the night before the Ides of March, Calpurnia had a nightmare that was so disturbing it made her beg Caesar not to go to the Senate that day. The ancient sources give slightly different versions of what exactly she dreamed. Some say she saw Caesar's statue spouting blood, others say she dreamed she was holding Caesar's murdered body in her arms. Either way, she woke up absolutely terrified and convinced that something terrible would happen if Caesar left the house on March 15th. Now, we need to understand the cultural context here. Romans took dreams seriously, especially prophetic dreams. This wasn't dismissed as superstitious nonsense. Dreams were considered genuine communications from the gods or harbingers of future events. When a woman of Calpurnia's status had a vivid nightmare about her husband's death, that was supposed to mean something. In the cultural logic of ancient Rome, ignoring such an obvious warning from the gods was either arrogant or suicidal, possibly both. Caesar's initial response was actually reasonable. He apparently decided to stay home. Calpurnia had convinced him, or maybe the dream's reported details had unsettled him, or possibly he was just tired and looking for an excuse not to deal with Senate business that day. For whatever reason, he sent word that he wouldn't be attending the Senate meeting. Crisis averted, assassination postponed, history changed, right? Not quite. Because this is where Decimus Brutus enters the picture, and he would prove to be one of the most effective of the conspirators specifically because Caesar trusted him. Decimus was one of Caesar's close associates, a military commander who had served with distinction in Gaul, someone Caesar considered a loyal friend. He was also one of the roughly 60 men planning to kill Caesar that day, which shows that Caesar's judgment of character wasn't perfect. Decimus showed up at Caesar's house that morning and found Caesar preparing to stay home based on Calpurnia's dream, and Decimus did what any good conspirator would do. He mocked the idea. According to the sources, Decimus essentially said that the Senate was waiting for Caesar. They had important business to discuss, and it would look absurd if the great Julius Caesar didn't show up because his wife had a bad dream. He made it about masculinity, about duty, about not appearing weak or superstitious, and it worked. Caesar decided to go to the Senate after all, overriding Calpurnia's pleas. This is one of those tragic historical moments where you want to reach back through time and shake someone. Calpurnia was right. The dream was right. The gods, fate, or just basic pattern recognition had given Caesar a clear warning, and he ignored it because he was more concerned about looking weak than about staying alive. There's a lesson there about toxic masculinity and its relationship to terrible decision-making, but we'll leave that for another time. What's interesting is how Calpurnia was viewed historically after Caesar's death. She wasn't blamed for failing to stop him. If anything, she was portrayed sympathetically as the faithful wife who tried to prevent tragedy and was ignored. But she also disappeared from historical importance almost immediately after Caesar's assassination. She survived him, presumably lived out the rest of her life quietly, and is barely mentioned again in the sources. In the grand narrative of Caesar's life, Calpurnia served her purpose as the prophetic voice that wasn't heeded, and then became historically irrelevant. But let's contrast Calpurnia, the respectable traditional Roman wife, with the woman who really drove the Senate absolutely insane, Cleopatra. Because if Caesar's relationship with Calpurnia was politically neutral, his relationship with Cleopatra was a propaganda disaster that his enemies exploited mercilessly. Cleopatra wasn't just any foreign ruler. She was the Queen of Egypt, one of the wealthiest nations in the Mediterranean world, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and someone who understood power politics as well as anyone in the ancient world. She was also, importantly, not Roman. And not just not Roman, she was African, Egyptian, Hellenistic, everything that represented the opposite of traditional Roman values in the minds of conservative senators. That Caesar would not only have a relationship with her but would conduct it relatively openly was seen as another sign of his monarchical ambitions and his contempt for Roman traditions. The relationship started during the Alexandrian War around 48 to 47 BC. Caesar had gone to Egypt chasing Pompey after defeating him at Pharsalus, only to discover that the Egyptians had already killed Pompey and wanted to present his head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, who apparently had standards about how his enemies should be killed, was reportedly horrified by this, which shows that even in brutal Roman politics there were lines of basic decency that one wasn't supposed to cross, and presenting. Someone's severed head as a welcoming gift was apparently over that line. While in Egypt sorting out this mess, Caesar got involved in a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. The traditional story is that Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's residence rolled up in a carpet or bedding, which is either brilliantly dramatic or completely made up by ancient historians who loved a good story. Either way, Caesar sided with Cleopatra, helped her win the civil war against her brother, and established her as the ruler of Egypt. He also, somewhat famously, had an affair with her that produced a son named Caesarion, whose name is about as subtle as naming your kid Junior, except more dynastic. Now, from a pure political standpoint, Caesar's alliance with Cleopatra made perfect sense. Egypt was phenomenally wealthy, Rome relied on Egyptian grain, and having a friendly ruler in Alexandria was strategically valuable. Supporting Cleopatra against her brother was just smart geopolitics. But Caesar could have done all of that without conducting a personal relationship that gave his enemies ammunition, and he chose not to. Whether this was because he genuinely cared for Cleopatra, or because he enjoyed the political theatre, or because he was 52 years old and Cleopatra was in her early 20s, and good judgment sometimes takes a vacation, we don't really know. What we do know is that it gave the Senate exactly the kind of scandal they needed to attack Caesar's character. The propaganda against Caesar and Cleopatra was vicious. She was portrayed as a seductive foreign temptress who had enslaved Caesar's judgment, a barbarian queen who was manipulating the greatest Roman general for her own ends, a threat to Roman sovereignty who would corrupt Roman values with Egyptian decadence. None of this was fair or accurate. Cleopatra was an intelligent, capable ruler who had her own political interests and wasn't anyone's puppet. But truth rarely matters in political smear campaigns, and the Senate needed to undermine Caesar's support however they could. When Cleopatra actually came to Rome, probably in 46 BC, it caused absolute pandemonium among the conservative elite. Caesar installed her in one of his villas across the Tiber, which was technically outside the city proper but close enough to be scandalous. She brought Caesarion with her, which was an implicit claim that Caesar had an heir. Caesar apparently visited her regularly and made no particular secret of their relationship. For the Senate, this was confirmation of everything they'd feared. Caesar was acting like an Eastern monarch, maintaining a foreign queen as his consort, producing royal offspring, surrounding himself with the trappings of kingship that were anathema to Republican Rome. The cultural clash here is important to understand. Rome was deeply patriarchal and had very specific ideas about how women should behave. Roman women of the upper classes were supposed to be modest, domestic, focused on managing households and raising children. They could be politically influential through their husbands and sons, but this influence was supposed to be subtle and private. Public displays of female power made Romans profoundly uncomfortable. Cleopatra represented everything Roman culture wasn't. She was a ruling queen in her own right, not through a husband. She participated directly in politics and military affairs. She was educated in multiple languages, studied philosophy and rhetoric, conducted diplomatic negotiations personally. She was about as far from the Roman ideal of feminine domesticity as you could get without actively going to war, which she would later do during the civil war following Caesar's assassination, but that's another story. The Senate's propaganda painted Cleopatra as corrupting Caesar, making him forget his Roman values and identity. The implicit message was that Caesar had been seduced into thinking he could rule like an Egyptian pharaoh or a Hellenistic king, that his relationship with Cleopatra proved he'd abandoned the austere simplicity of Roman leadership for Eastern decadence and tyranny. This was particularly effective because it tied together multiple threads: Caesar's monarchical tendencies, his disrespect for tradition, his foreign entanglements, his personal moral failings. Cleopatra became a symbol of everything that was supposedly wrong with Caesar. What often gets lost in this narrative is that Cleopatra was actually a skilled political operator in her own right, who was using her relationship with Caesar just as strategically as he was using his relationship with her. She needed Roman support to maintain her position in Egypt. Caesar needed Egyptian resources and a reliable ally in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a mutually beneficial political partnership that happened to also involve romance, which isn't uncommon in political history. But because Cleopatra was a woman and a foreigner, she got portrayed as the seductive villain rather than the strategic ally she actually was. There were other women in Caesar's life who played smaller but still significant roles. His daughter Julia, who had been married to Pompey, had been a crucial element in the political alliance that held the first triumvirate together. When she died in childbirth in 54 BC, it removed one of the key emotional bonds between Caesar and Pompey, contributing to their eventual civil war. Julia's death was mourned by both her father and her husband, but it was also a political disaster that helped push Rome toward conflict. Women in Roman politics often served as the human bridges between powerful men, and when those bridges broke, the consequences could be catastrophic. Caesar's mother Aurelia was apparently a formidable woman who influenced his early career, though sources on her are limited. His first wife Cornelia, daughter of a political ally, gave him his only legitimate daughter and was apparently genuinely loved by Caesar, unusual enough in political marriages to be noted by ancient historians. His second wife, Pompeia, was divorced after she was connected to a religious scandal involving another man, leading to Caesar's famous quote about his wife needing to be above suspicion. Each of these women played roles in Caesar's rise, and each demonstrates how women in Roman society could be politically significant even while being legally and socially subordinate. What's frustrating from a historical perspective is how little we actually know about these women as individuals. Ancient historians, being overwhelmingly male, focused on men's actions and treated women primarily as supporting characters in male narratives. Calpurnia's thoughts about her husband's murder beyond her prophetic dream? Unknown. Cleopatra's actual opinions about Caesar beyond the political alliance? Mostly speculation. What Julia really thought about being used as a political pawn in her father's alliance building? We'll never know. But what we do know is that Caesar's relationships with women, particularly Cleopatra, were used effectively by his enemies to attack his character and legitimacy. In a culture as traditionally patriarchal as Rome, a man's ability to properly manage his household and his relationships with women was seen as reflecting his ability to manage public affairs. Caesar's apparent infatuation with a foreign queen suggested poor judgment, weakness, and dangerous susceptibility to manipulation. Whether any of this was actually true didn't matter. What mattered was that it was believable enough to be politically useful. The presence of Cleopatra in Rome also raised uncomfortable questions about succession and dynasty. Caesarion was Caesar's biological son, even if not legitimate by Roman law. If Caesar was moving toward monarchy, and many believed he was, then having an heir was the natural next step. That this heir would be half Egyptian rather than fully Roman made the prospect even more disturbing to traditionalists. They could envision a future where Rome was ruled by Caesar's dynasty, with Ptolemaic blood mixing with Roman, with the clear distinction between Romans and foreigners breaking down, with the entire structure of Roman identity being fundamentally transformed. These fears weren't entirely irrational. The Roman world that emerged after Caesar's assassination was indeed ruled by dynasties, starting with Augustus establishing the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The Republic was replaced by an empire where legitimacy came through family lineage rather than electoral politics. Women in the imperial family became more publicly powerful than Republican women had ever been. Think of Livia, Augustus's wife, or later Agrippina. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra prefigured these changes, suggesting a future that many Romans found terrifying. When the conspirators decided to kill Caesar, they weren't just removing a politically dangerous general or preventing a potential tyrant. They were also, in their minds, preventing Rome from becoming something fundamentally foreign and un-Roman. Cleopatra symbolized that transformation, the mixing of cultures, the elevation of women to public power, the adoption of Eastern royal practices, the end of the austere, masculine, militaristic culture that had made Rome great. By killing Caesar, they thought they could prevent all of that. They were wrong, of course. Cleopatra would go on to survive Caesar, ally with Mark Antony, fight a civil war, and eventually die in Egypt after being defeated by Caesar's adopted heir. Her story didn't end with Caesar's assassination. If anything, it became even more dramatic. But in the context of understanding why Caesar was killed, the role of Cleopatra and other women in his life matters. They gave his enemies ammunition, they symbolized his supposed corruption and monarchical ambitions, and they represented the ways Caesar was transforming Roman society beyond just political structures. The tragic irony is that Calpurnia, the proper, respectable, traditional Roman wife, tried to prevent the assassination and was ignored. While the attacks on Caesar's character often centered on Cleopatra, the improper, powerful foreign woman who was actually nowhere near Rome when the assassination happened. In the end, the proper Roman wife's warning failed to protect her husband, while the scandalous foreign queen survived to fight another day. Roman morality and Roman reality didn't always align, which probably shouldn't surprise anyone who spent any time studying history. Now that we've covered Caesar's military power, economic populism, and complicated personal life, we need to talk about something he was arguably even better at than conquering Gaul, managing his own public image. Because Caesar didn't just become famous through his achievements. He became famous because he was absolutely brilliant at making sure everyone knew about his achievements, packaging them in ways that were impossible to ignore, and essentially creating the ancient world's first comprehensive political brand. If Caesar were alive today, he'd either be running a country or heading up the world's most successful marketing agency, possibly both simultaneously. Let's start with the commentaries on the Gallic War, which is possibly the most successful piece of political propaganda ever written, masquerading as a straightforward military report. Caesar wrote these during his campaigns in Gaul, ostensibly to keep the Senate informed about what he was doing with Rome's legions. But calling these military reports is like calling the Super Bowl a sporting event. Technically accurate, but missing the entire point. The commentaries are written in Latin prose that's clear, direct, and remarkably readable even 2,000 years later. They're still assigned in Latin classes today, which is partly because they're good examples of clear Latin writing, and partly because reading about Caesar conquering barbarians is more interesting than parsing grammatical structures, at least in theory. But the real genius of these texts isn't their style, it's their content and perspective. Caesar wrote about himself in the third person throughout. Not I crossed the Rhine, but Caesar crossed the Rhine. This creates an interesting psychological effect. By referring to himself in the third person, Caesar made himself seem more objective, like he was just reporting facts rather than promoting himself. It also elevated him above normal human perspective. He wasn't just a general describing his own actions, he was a historical figure whose deeds were being recorded for posterity. The subtle message was that Caesar wasn't just winning battles, he was making history that would be studied for generations, which turned out to be accurate, but that doesn't make it less manipulative as a propaganda technique. What's particularly clever about the third-person narration is that it creates emotional distance that makes Caesar's achievements seem more impressive. When you read "I defeated an army," there's an implicit ego involved. When you read "Caesar defeated an army," it sounds like an objective historical fact. Caesar managed to write propaganda that didn't feel like propaganda, which is the holy grail of political communication. Modern politicians have entire teams trying to achieve what Caesar did naturally, making self-promotion seem like humble, factual reporting. The structure of the commentaries also deserves attention. Each book, there were 8 covering the Gallic Wars plus additional volumes covering the Civil War, was organized around annual campaigns. This gave readers a sense of progression, of steady advancement toward complete conquest. Caesar wasn't just winning random battles, he was systematically conquering an entire region, expanding Roman power in an organized, logical way. The narrative arc suggested inevitability, that Gaul was always going to fall to Roman arms, which made Caesar's victories seem like manifest destiny rather than military conquests that could have gone differently. The descriptions of barbarian tribes in the commentaries were also calculated for maximum impact. Caesar portrayed the Gauls as numerous, fierce warriors who fought bravely, which made Roman victories more impressive. But he also described them as disorganized, prone to internal conflicts, and ultimately inferior to Roman discipline and tactics. The message was clear. These were worthy opponents that required real military skill to defeat, but they were never really a threat to Roman superiority. Caesar's task was difficult enough to demonstrate his competence, but never so difficult that success was in doubt. Caesar's treatment of the Germans in his commentaries is particularly interesting. He described them as even more primitive and dangerous than the Gauls, huge warlike tribes living in dense forests, barely touched by civilization. This served multiple purposes. It justified Caesar's campaigns beyond Gaul into Germanic territory. He was protecting Rome from barbarian threats. It made his famous bridge building across the Rhine seem even more impressive. He'd crossed into territory even the Gauls feared. And it established Caesar as Rome's defender against existential threats, not just an ambitious general seeking glory. The battles in the commentaries are described with Caesar making brilliant tactical decisions, his soldiers performing heroically, and his enemies being numerous and dangerous enough to make Roman victories impressive, but not so competent that they ever really threatened Caesar's ultimate success. Every setback is temporary, every challenge is overcome through Caesar's quick thinking, every victory demonstrates his military genius. It's like watching an action movie where the hero is always in danger, but you know he's going to win because he's the protagonist. But here's where it gets clever. Caesar doesn't come across as boastful in these writings. He's matter-of-fact, almost modest. He attributes victories to his soldiers' courage and discipline. He describes his own strategic insights as obvious responses to battlefield conditions. The overall effect is of someone who's incredibly competent but not arrogant about it, which is a difficult balance to strike, and Caesar does it perfectly. You finish reading the commentaries thinking this Caesar fellow seems quite capable, rather than this guy is insufferable, which is exactly the response Caesar wanted. The commentaries were copied and circulated throughout Rome and Italy. People read them like we'd follow a military campaign on social media today. Each new installment provided updates on Caesar's latest conquests, his encounters with strange barbarian tribes, his engineering marvels, his narrow escapes and unlikely victories. It was entertainment and propaganda combined, creating a narrative where Caesar was the hero of his own epic story. By the time Caesar returned to Rome, his reputation had been built not just through his actual achievements, but through his own carefully crafted narrative about those achievements. Compare this to other Roman generals, who typically relied on other people to write about their accomplishments. They'd hire historians or hope that sympathetic writers would record their victories. Caesar cut out the middleman and wrote his own legend, which guaranteed that the story would be told exactly how he wanted it told. It's the difference between hoping for good press coverage and owning the entire media outlet. But written propaganda was only one tool in Caesar's public image arsenal. The man understood visual propaganda just as well, which brings us to coins. Roman coins had traditionally featured gods, mythological scenes, or symbolic images representing Roman values. They were currency, sure, but they were also tiny pieces of art that conveyed messages about Roman identity and history. What they didn't typically feature was the face of a living Roman leader. Caesar changed that. Starting around 44 BC, coins were minted with Caesar's profile on them. This was revolutionary and controversial in equal measure. It implied that Caesar was comparable to gods and legendary figures, that he deserved the same kind of veneration. In cultures where putting your face on currency was reserved for monarchs and deities, this sent a very clear message about how Caesar viewed his own status. And because coins circulated everywhere, through every market, every shop, every household in the empire, this meant Caesar's face was literally in everyone's hands. You couldn't conduct business without handling Caesar's image, which is subliminal marketing that modern advertisers can only dream about. The coins also featured inscriptions and symbols that reinforced Caesar's key messages. Some showed Caesar wearing the laurel wreath of victory. Others included titles like dictator, or referenced his position as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. Each coin was a tiny propaganda poster that you carried in your pocket, saw in your transactions, and thought about every time you bought bread or paid your rent. The cumulative effect was to make Caesar's presence inescapable, his authority visible in the most mundane aspects of daily life. Then there were the public spectacles, which Caesar used with devastating effectiveness. Roman culture loved public entertainment. Gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, chariot races, public executions. These weren't just entertainment, they were political tools. Leaders who sponsored impressive games earned public goodwill. The bigger and more spectacular the games, the more gratitude and loyalty they generated. Caesar understood this instinctively and took it to levels that made previous attempts at public entertainment look like amateur productions. His games featured hundreds of gladiators at once, not just the typical handful. He imported exotic animals from Africa, elephants, lions, even a giraffe at one point, which most Romans had never seen before. He staged mock naval battles in flooded arenas, which is the kind of logistical nightmare that most people wouldn't even attempt, but Caesar pulled off just to prove he could. These spectacles weren't just showing off, they were demonstrations of power. Caesar was saying, I command such resources, such organizational capacity, such wealth, that I can flood an arena and stage a naval battle for your entertainment. That's a flex that makes modern political rallies look understated. The scale of these games was genuinely unprecedented. One of Caesar's gladiatorial spectacles reportedly featured 320 pairs of gladiators fighting simultaneously. To put that in perspective, typical games might feature 10 or 20 gladiators over the course of a day. Caesar was fielding small armies of fighters for public entertainment. The logistics alone were staggering, housing and feeding hundreds of gladiators, maintaining their equipment, coordinating the fights, managing the crowd. It was the ancient equivalent of producing a blockbuster movie, except it was live, bloody, and happening right in front of tens of thousands of Romans. The mock naval battle, Naumachia, that Caesar staged in 46 BC was particularly insane. He had a basin dug near the Tiber, filled it with water, and staged a battle involving thousands of combatants and dozens of ships representing Tyrian and Egyptian fleets. People literally died in this entertainment. It wasn't staged violence, it was actual combat with real casualties, and Romans watched it as entertainment while simultaneously being awed by the sheer organisational capacity required to pull it off. Caesar was demonstrating that he could command resources and manpower on a scale that transformed him from a politician into something approaching a living force of nature. The exotic animals were another brilliant propaganda move. Most Romans had never travelled beyond Italy, had never seen the creatures that existed in Africa or Asia. When Caesar paraded elephants, rhinoceroses, and giraffes through Rome, he was bringing the entire world to his audience. Each exotic animal was proof of Rome's, and by extension Caesar's, reach and power. He wasn't just conquering territories, he was mastering the natural world itself, bending it to Roman will for public amusement. The subliminal message was that if Caesar could capture a giraffe and bring it to Rome for your entertainment, what couldn't he do? The gladiatorial games themselves carried layers of meaning beyond simple entertainment. Gladiators were usually slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, people at the absolute bottom of Roman social hierarchy. Watching them fight and die reinforced social hierarchies and Roman superiority. But Caesar's games were so spectacular that they transcended typical class dynamics. Everyone from senators to poor plebeians attended. It was one of the few spaces where all of Roman society mixed, and Caesar made himself the centre of that experience. Every social class associated him with entertainment, spectacle, and the good things in life. The triumphs, formal military victory celebrations, were another propaganda goldmine. When a Roman general won a significant victory, he could request a triumph, which was essentially a massive parade through Rome displaying the spoils of war, conquered enemies, and the victorious army. These were carefully choreographed spectacles designed to make the general look as glorious as possible, while demonstrating Rome's power to both citizens and any diplomatic guests who happened to be watching. Caesar celebrated multiple triumphs, and he made sure they were absolutely unforgettable. The triumph for his victories in Gaul lasted several days and included displays of treasure, exotic prisoners, and elaborate floats depicting his greatest battles. He distributed money to citizens, gave bonuses to his soldiers, and threw public feasts. The message was clear. Following Caesar led to wealth, victory, and glory for everyone involved. The Senate could give speeches about traditional values, but Caesar was handing out actual cash and entertainment. But perhaps Caesar's most controversial propaganda move was his growing willingness to accept, even encourage, quasi-divine honours. Temples were erected in his honour in the provinces. His statue was placed in the Temple of Quirinus, alongside Rome's legendary founder Romulus. Coins and inscriptions began referring to him as demigod, or using language that suggested divine favour. A month was renamed in his honour, July, previously Quintilis. These honours accumulated gradually, each one pushing a bit further, testing how much godlike veneration Romans would accept for a living leader. The Senate, naturally, was horrified. Romans had a complicated relationship with divinity and politics. They believed in divine favour, sure, and legendary figures from Rome's past had supposedly been deified after death. But a living Roman, accepting worship like an Eastern monarch or Hellenistic king? That violated fundamental Roman values about equality among citizens and the rejection of monarchy. Caesar was supposed to be first among equals, not a living god. The cult of personality he was building suggested he saw himself as above and beyond normal Roman leadership, which confirmed every fear the traditionalists had about his ultimate intentions. Here's where we need to understand the cultural difference between Roman and Eastern concepts of rulership. In Egypt, the pharaoh was literally considered a god. In the Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged after Alexander's conquests, rulers were routinely deified and worshipped in temples. This wasn't controversial, it was just how monarchy worked in those cultures. But Rome had been founded on the explicit rejection of monarchy. The last Roman king had been overthrown 500 years earlier, and Romans prided themselves on having a system where no one person could become too powerful. The very word king, rex in Latin, was almost taboo. Accepting divine honours was getting dangerously close to kingship, and that was a line Romans were not supposed to cross. Caesar's defenders would argue that he never actually claimed to be a god, that these honours were being offered to him by grateful citizens and provinces, that he was just accepting what was being freely given. His critics would argue that he was absolutely encouraging this worship, that his refusal to reject divine honours was the same as claiming them, and that the whole thing was a calculated move toward establishing himself as a monarch in everything but name. Both sides had legitimate points, which is why the controversy was so intense. The propaganda war wasn't just about Caesar promoting himself, it was also about his enemies trying to tear down his image. The Senate and Caesar's political opponents spread their own narratives. They portrayed him as a tyrant, a would-be king, a destroyer of Roman liberty. They emphasized his affair with Cleopatra as evidence of his un-Roman decadence. They claimed his soldiers were more loyal to him than to Rome, suggesting he was building a personal army rather than serving the state. They accused him of using state resources for personal glorification, of undermining the constitution, of disrespecting the Senate and traditional authority. What's fascinating is that many of these criticisms were accurate. Caesar was building personal loyalty among his soldiers. He was using state resources for personal political advantage. He was undermining traditional senatorial authority. But Caesar's propaganda was effective enough that these accusations didn't really stick with the general population. The average Roman didn't care whether Caesar was technically violating constitutional norms. They cared that he'd brought peace after civil war, that he'd distributed land and money, that he'd provided entertainment and jobs. Caesar's actions spoke louder than the Senate's accusations. The Senate also suffered from a fundamental credibility problem. When they accused Caesar of corruption, the public's response was basically, "You mean like what all of you do?" When they complained that Caesar was ignoring senatorial authority, ordinary Romans weren't particularly sympathetic because they'd watched the Senate be ineffective and self-serving for decades. When the Senate called Caesar a tyrant, people looked at the tangible benefits they'd received from Caesar's policies and wondered what exactly made traditional senatorial oligarchy better than Caesar's efficient dictatorship. Caesar also understood something about human psychology that modern politicians still exploit. People respond more to stories than to abstract principles. The Senate could talk about constitutional procedures and the sanctity of republican government, but these were abstract concepts. Caesar gave people narratives they could understand. The brave general conquering barbarians to protect Rome, the generous leader distributing wealth to deserving citizens, the capable administrator fixing problems the Senate had ignored. Stories are more compelling than constitutional arguments, and Caesar was telling better stories than his opponents. The visual symbolism Caesar employed was also carefully chosen. The laurel wreath he wore wasn't just decorative, it was associated with military victory and had quasi-sacred significance. The purple toga he was entitled to wear as a triumph celebrant was traditionally reserved for special occasions, but Caesar started wearing it more regularly, making it part of his everyday appearance. These visual markers set him apart from other senators and generals, made him instantly recognizable, and reinforced his special status. If you saw Caesar approaching, there was no mistaking who he was, which is exactly the kind of brand recognition modern politicians spend fortunes trying to achieve. The Senate's problem was that they couldn't compete with Caesar's propaganda machine because they didn't really understand they were in a propaganda war. They thought political legitimacy came from institutional authority and traditional respect for the Senate. Caesar understood that political legitimacy in practice came from public perception, and public perception could be shaped through strategic communication. The Senate was playing checkers while Caesar was playing chess, and they didn't realize it until they were being checkmated. This is why Caesar's assassination was never just about killing one man. The conspirators needed to destroy the image Caesar had built, the narrative he'd created, the public perception that he was indispensable. They hoped that by killing Caesar, they'd break the spell his propaganda had cast over Roman society. People would suddenly realize they'd been following a tyrant. Traditional republican values would reassert themselves, and Rome would return to normal. This catastrophically misunderstood how propaganda works. You can kill the person, but the image lives on. Caesar had spent decades building his legend, and that legend didn't die when he did. If anything, his assassination made the legend stronger. The great leader murdered by envious senators, the champion of the people struck down by the oligarchy, the military genius killed by lesser men who couldn't match his achievements. Mark Antony understood this immediately, which is why he was able to turn Caesar's funeral into a propaganda victory that made the conspirators look like villains and Caesar look like a martyr. The really twisted irony is that Caesar's propaganda was so effective that it outlived not just him, but the entire civilization that created it. We're still reading his commentaries 2,000 years later. His name became a title for rulers, Kaiser, Tsar, all derive from Caesar. The month of July still carries his name. His image appears on countless paintings, sculptures, coins, books, movies. The man who used propaganda to build a political career ended up creating a legend that transcended death, transcended Rome, transcended everything he could have imagined. The Senate tried to erase him and instead made him immortal. So we've talked about Caesar's military genius, his economic reforms, his relationship dramas, and his propaganda brilliance. But all of that raises an obvious question. If Caesar was such a threat to the Republic, if his rise to power was so dangerous, why didn't the Republican system stop him earlier? Why did it take assassination to remove him when the Republic supposedly had constitutional safeguards against precisely this kind of power accumulation? The uncomfortable answer is that by the time Caesar rose to prominence, the Roman Republic was already broken. It wasn't functioning properly. The constitutional safeguards had been eroded or ignored. The careful balance of power that was supposed to prevent tyranny had been undermined by decades of political violence, corruption, and institutional decay. Caesar didn't destroy the Republic. He was the symptom of a Republic that had already destroyed itself. Understanding this is crucial to understanding why the assassination was such a catastrophic miscalculation. Let's start with the fundamental problem. The Roman Republic's governmental structure was designed for a city-state, not a Mediterranean-spanning empire. When Rome was just controlling Italy and maybe some nearby territories, the system worked reasonably well. You had 2 consuls elected annually to share executive power, ensuring no one person could dominate. You had the Senate advising on policy and serving as a stabilizing force of experienced statesmen. You had various assemblies where citizens could vote on laws and elect officials. There were checks and balances, term limits, and a culture that supposedly valued the collective good over individual ambition. But Rome's success in conquering most of the known world had created problems the founders never anticipated. By the 1st century BC, Rome controlled territory from Spain to Syria, from North Africa to the Alps. Managing this empire required standing armies, permanent administrative structures, and quick decision-making capabilities that the republican system simply wasn't designed to provide. The careful checks and balances that prevented tyranny also prevented effective governance at imperial scale. Consider the basic logistics of communication. If you're governing Spain from Rome and something urgent happens, it takes weeks just to get a message to and from the provincial governor. By the time the Senate in Rome could debate an issue, form a committee to study it, and send back instructions, the situation on the ground might have changed completely. This makes the whole idea of Senate oversight basically theatrical. They could give advice and issue orders, but by the time those orders arrived, they were often irrelevant. Provincial governors necessarily had enormous autonomy because there was no practical way to micromanage them from Rome. This created the first major problem. Provincial governorships became essentially independent power bases. A governor with proconsular authority, commanding legions far from Rome, was for all practical purposes the absolute ruler of his province. He could levy taxes, dispense justice, command military forces, and make decisions that affected millions of people. The only real check on his power was that he'd eventually have to return to Rome and face potential prosecution if he'd been too egregiously corrupt. But too egregiously corrupt was a high bar in a system where everyone understood that provincial appointments were opportunities for personal enrichment. The case of Verres, who governed Sicily from 73 to 71 BC, illustrates both the problem and the system's inadequate response. Verres was prosecuted by Cicero for extortion after his governorship, and the evidence of his corruption was overwhelming. He'd looted temples, stolen art, extorted money from cities, sold judicial decisions, and generally treated Sicily as his personal piggy bank. The prosecution laid out case after case of systematic theft and abuse of power. And yet Verres almost got away with it, would have gotten away with it if he'd had better political connections in Rome. Eventually he fled into exile, which sounds like justice until you realize he took all his stolen wealth with him and lived comfortably for decades. The message to other governors was clear: steal whatever you can, and even if you get caught, you'll probably keep your plunder. The thing about the Verres case is that everyone acknowledged his corruption was extreme even by Roman standards. If a governor whose crimes were considered exceptional barely faced consequences, what about all the governors whose corruption was just normal, accepted, business as usual? They faced no consequences at all. because no one bothered to prosecute behaviour that was considered standard procedure. The system had normalised the idea that provincial governorships were opportunities for personal enrichment, and as long as you didn't steal too obviously, or from people with powerful Roman connections, you'd never face prosecution. This normalisation of corruption had effects that rippled through Roman society. Young men from aristocratic families grew up understanding that the path to wealth was through office holding, that governance was a means to personal enrichment rather than public service. Political careers became financial investments. You'd borrow money to fund your election campaigns, expecting to recoup those investments, and much more when you got appointed to a lucrative province. This created a system where being honest was actually a rational behaviour. If you governed your province ethically, you'd return to Rome in debt from your election expenses. Your competitors who had stolen freely would be wealthy and able to fund their next campaigns. The system punished integrity and rewarded corruption. The standard career path for ambitious Roman politicians had become: bribe your way into office, get appointed to govern a province, extract as much wealth as possible from that province, return to Rome rich enough to bribe your way into higher. Office, repeat. This wasn't a secret. Everyone knew this is how things worked. The Senate would occasionally prosecute someone for extortion when their corruption became politically convenient to punish, but it wasn't a systematic attempt to enforce good governance. It was political theatre and score settling. This brings us to the second major problem. Corruption had become so normalised that the system essentially ran on it. Elections weren't decided by policy debates or candidate qualifications. They were decided by who could afford the biggest bribes to voters, and we're not talking subtle influence here. This was open, shameless vote buying. Candidates would literally distribute money to citizens in exchange for votes. The only illegal part was getting caught being too obvious about it. Wealthy families maintained networks of clients, people who owed them favours or received financial support, who were expected to vote as their patrons directed. The Senate itself had become less a deliberative body making decisions for Rome's benefit, and more a club for aristocratic families protecting their collective interests. Senators weren't generally there because they were the most qualified to govern. They were there because they'd been born into the right families and had enough money to advance through the cursus honorum. The idea that the best people rose to leadership based on merit was laughable. The system was designed to ensure that only the wealthy elite could ever access real power, and then that elite used their power to maintain their wealth and privilege. Class conflict had also become dangerously acute. The gap between the ultra-wealthy and everyone else had grown into an unbridgeable chasm. A handful of families controlled most of the land, most of the wealth, most of the political offices. Meanwhile, the middle class of small farmers who had once formed the backbone of Roman military and economic power had been effectively destroyed. They couldn't compete economically with large estates worked by slaves. They lost their land to aristocratic creditors when they couldn't pay debts. They moved to Rome looking for work and ended up dependent on grain doles and whatever employment they could find in a city where most actual labour was done by slaves. The destruction of the small farmer class was particularly devastating because these people had been the foundation of Roman military might. The traditional Roman legion was composed of citizen soldiers who owned property. They had something to fight for, a stake in Rome's success. But as small farms were consolidated into large estates, as farmers were driven into debt and lost their land, the pool of property-owning citizens available for military service shrank dramatically. This is what had forced Marius to reform the military in the first place, opening service to the landless poor. But that reform, while practically necessary, fundamentally changed the nature of Roman military service from civic duty to paid employment. The large estates, latifundia, that replaced small farms were economically more efficient in the short term. Using slave labour and economies of scale, large landowners could produce grain and other crops more cheaply than small farmers. But this efficiency came at an enormous social cost. It created a rural economy where the profits went entirely to aristocratic landowners while generating minimal employment for free citizens. The countryside was depopulated as displaced farmers moved to urban centres, and the urban centres couldn't absorb this influx of landless citizens into productive employment because slaves did most actual labour. This created Rome's permanent underclass, hundreds of thousands of citizens who had the formal rights of citizenship but no economic security or opportunity for advancement. They lived in massive apartment buildings, insulum, that were notorious fire hazards built as cheaply as possible to maximize rents. Multiple families would crowd into small apartments. The ground floors might have shops or workshops, but the upper floors were purely residential and often in terrible condition. The rent was still substantial compared to what these families could earn, creating a situation where people were constantly on the edge of financial disaster. The daily life of ordinary Romans in the city was precarious in ways that contrasted sharply with the extreme wealth of the aristocracy. While senators lived in spacious houses with slaves to meet their every need, ordinary citizens dealt with overcrowding, poor sanitation, constant noise, and the ever-present risk of fire or building collapse. The famous ancient writer Juvenal would later write about life in these buildings, describing how the poor lived in fear that their apartments would collapse and kill them in their sleep, which actually happened with some regularity. This isn't the kind of foundation on which stable societies are built. This created a Roman urban population that was economically desperate and politically volatile. They had the right to vote, but no real economic stake in society. They were citizens, but had no path to economic advancement. They could theoretically participate in governance, but their votes could be bought for a few coins or a promise of entertainment. The Senate's response to this growing underclass was essentially, "Have you tried not being poor?" combined with minimal handouts to prevent outright starvation and riots. The Gracchi brothers had tried to address these problems back in the 130s and 120s BC through land reform and grain distribution. The Senate's response was to have them killed and pretend the problems didn't exist. This set a precedent that would haunt the late Republic. When reformers tried to change the system responded with violence. Political disagreements that might have been resolved through compromise and constitutional processes instead became battles, where murder was an acceptable tool of political conflict. The use of political violence kept escalating. Sulla marched on Rome with his army in 88 BC, establishing that military force could override civilian authority. He became dictator, killed his political enemies in systematic purges, and tried to reform the constitution to strengthen the Senate. When he died, his reforms were gradually undone, but the precedent remained. Military power trumped legal authority if you were willing to use it. The Senate had learned they could kill reformers. Ambitious generals had learned they could use armies against Rome itself. Neither lesson was conducive to stable republican government. By the time Caesar entered politics, the unwritten rules of Roman political life included, "Don't propose reforms that threaten senatorial privilege or you'll be killed," and "accumulate enough military power that you can't be killed if you do threaten." Senatorial privilege? This is not a stable system. This is a system in its death spiral, where every faction knows that playing by the traditional rules means losing, so everyone stops playing by the rules, which makes the situation worse, which encourages more rule-breaking in an accelerating cycle of dysfunction. The first triumvirate, the informal alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus around 60 BC, was itself evidence of systemic failure. These three men basically said, the Senate is hopelessly gridlocked, so we're going to privately agree on what policies Rome will follow, and then use our combined influence to make it happen regardless of what the Senate wants. This was blatantly unconstitutional. It was three private citizens deciding to override the government through backroom dealing, and everyone knew about it, complained about it, and ultimately accepted it because it was more effective than the legitimate constitutional process. Think about what that means. Rome's government had become so dysfunctional that an illegal conspiracy between three powerful men was an improvement over the normal operation of republican institutions. That's a damning indictment of how broken things had become, and it wasn't like the triumvirate was a secret cabal. It was open knowledge that these three were coordinating. The Senate couldn't stop them because the Senate had no way to stop anyone who had enough power and was willing to use it. The military reforms of Marius several decades earlier had also fundamentally changed Roman power dynamics. Traditionally, soldiers were citizens who owned property. They had something to fight for and would return to their farms after service. Marius opened military service to the landless poor, which created a professional army of soldiers whose only economic security came from their military career. These men weren't fighting for Rome's glory, they were fighting for their general's promises of land and bonuses after retirement. Their loyalty was personal and economic, not patriotic in the traditional sense. This created the conditions Caesar exploited so effectively. generals who could command armies more loyal to them personally than to the state. But Caesar didn't invent this dynamic, he just used it more skillfully than anyone before him. The system had already been transformed into one where military commanders with loyal armies were the real power in Rome, regardless of what the constitution said. The Senate could pass all the laws they wanted, but a general with legions could ignore those laws with impunity. The courts had also become tools of political warfare rather than neutral arbiters of justice. Prosecutions weren't about enforcing the law, they were about destroying political enemies. Bribery of juries was routine, testimony was bought and sold. Convictions depended less on guilt, and more on which side had more political muscle at that particular moment. This made legal proceedings a joke. Everyone knew that justice in Roman courts wasn't about truth or law, it was about power and connections. Even the core concept that was supposed to prevent tyranny, the annual rotation of magistrates, had become counterproductive. Having leaders change every year meant no one had time to implement long-term policies or build institutional knowledge. It encouraged short-term thinking and personal enrichment during your limited time in office. It fragmented authority and made coordinated action nearly impossible. The system had been designed to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power, but in practice it just ensured that no one could govern effectively. The Senate's response to all these problems was to deny they existed, or blame them on moral decay and loss of traditional values. According to the traditional narrative, things had worked fine in the old days when Romans were virtuous, austere, and devoted to the collective good. The current problems were due to people becoming too wealthy, too influenced by Greek philosophy, too interested in personal gain rather than public service. The solution, therefore, was to return to traditional values and hope that solved everything. This is the ancient Roman version of kids these days' complaints, except instead of blaming smartphones and social media, they were blaming Greek rhetoric and fancy dinner parties. It completely missed the actual structural problems, that the governmental system couldn't scale to empire, that wealth concentration had created unsustainable inequality, that the constitutional protections had been eroded past the point of functionality. Talking about traditional values was easier than confronting the reality that fundamental reform was necessary. Caesar wasn't the cause of these problems, he was the inevitable result of a system that had stopped working. When normal constitutional procedures can't solve problems, people look for strongmen who can cut through the gridlock and actually govern. When the Senate proves itself incapable of managing an empire, someone who can manage an empire will rise to power. When the traditional paths to reform are blocked by violence and obstruction, reformers will find non-traditional paths. Caesar was answering a demand that Rome's dysfunctional system had created. This is why the assassination was such a catastrophic error in judgment. The conspirators thought they were killing a tyrant and would restore the Republic. But the Republic they wanted to restore didn't exist anymore. Its institutions had been hollowed out, its norms had been violated, its constitutional protections had been ignored into irrelevance. Killing Caesar didn't change any of that. It just removed the one person who had figured out how to govern despite the system's dysfunction. What followed Caesar's assassination wasn't the restoration of the Republic. It was another round of civil war as various strongmen fought over who would replace Caesar. Eventually Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir who would become Augustus, won. And he created a system that was formally republican but actually monarchical, keeping the titles and structures of the Republic while concentrating all real power in himself. The empire that emerged wasn't a deviation from republican norms, it was the logical conclusion of processes that had been destroying the Republic for generations. The Senate had multiple opportunities to reform the system before it reached the crisis point. They could have addressed wealth inequality. They could have reformed provincial governance to prevent abuse. They could have changed the electoral system to reduce corruption. They could have created administrative structures appropriate for governing an empire. They chose not to do any of these things because reform threatened their privileges, and they preferred systemic collapse to losing their advantages. This is why Caesar is sometimes described as the Republic's gravedigger, when he was actually just presiding over a funeral for something that was already dead. The true tragedy isn't that the Republic died. Institutions that can't adapt eventually fail. The tragedy is that so many people died in the process, that the transition from republic to empire required decades of civil war and political violence, that reforms that might have been implemented gradually instead came through revolutionary change. The Senate's refusal to acknowledge that the system needed fundamental restructuring made peaceful reform impossible, and violent upheaval inevitable. When we study the fall of the Roman Republic, we're really studying what happens when institutions become ends in themselves rather than means to governance. The Senate defended the Republic not because it was working, but because they benefited from its dysfunction. They preferred a system that served their interests poorly to taking any risk on reform. And the result was the destruction of everything they claimed to value. Caesar understood this even if the Senate didn't, which is why his rise was inevitable, and why killing him changed nothing about Rome's trajectory. The assassins thought they were heroes defending liberty. Actually, they were the final actors in a tragedy that had been playing out for generations, making the worst possible choice in a situation where there were no good options left. And the historical irony is that their noble act of defending the Republic probably did more to discredit republicanism than anything Caesar had done. They proved that the Republic couldn't protect itself even with assassination as a political tool, that its defenders were willing to murder but not to reform, that violence in defense of traditional institutions just led to more violence and eventually to the destruction of those institutions anyway. That's the real lesson of Caesar's assassination. You can't save a failed system by killing the people who point out it's failing. Reform requires confronting uncomfortable truths about why institutions aren't working and being willing to change them fundamentally. The Roman Senate couldn't do that, so they killed Caesar instead. And Rome became an empire, the very thing they'd murdered him to prevent. So we've established that Caesar had built an impressive power base, that the Republic was already broken, and that assassination was becoming a viable political tool in Roman society. Now we need to talk about the actual conspiracy itself, how roughly 60 Roman senators came together and decided that murdering the most powerful man in Rome was not just acceptable, but necessary. Because this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. This was a carefully planned political assassination involving dozens of people who had to coordinate, keep secrets, and convince themselves they were heroes rather than murderers. The psychology of how that happens is fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Let's start with the ringleaders, because every conspiracy needs leaders who are willing to take the first step and organize everyone else. The two main architects were Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, though their motivations for wanting Caesar dead were completely different, which tells you something about how diverse the conspiracy's membership actually was. Cassius was the practical, calculating one. He'd been a military commander, had served under Pompey during the Civil War, and had been captured and pardoned by Caesar after Pompey's defeat. This pardon should have created loyalty. Caesar had spared his life when he could have killed him. Instead, Cassius apparently spent the next several years nursing resentment and planning revenge. The ancient sources portray him as ambitious, envious, and bitter. He wanted power for himself and couldn't stand watching Caesar accumulate more of it. There's a famous description by Plutarch where Caesar supposedly said that Cassius had a lean and hungry look, basically calling him ambitious and dangerous, which turned out to be accurate character assessment. Cassius's motivations were straightforward. He wanted Caesar gone so he could advance his own career. Under Caesar's system, advancement came through Caesar's favour. Under the traditional republic, ambitious men like Cassius could compete for power through elections and military commands. Caesar's monopoly on authority blocked Cassius's path to the kind of prominence he thought he deserved. This is garden variety political ambition mixed with personal resentment. Not particularly noble, but at least honest about what it was. Brutus, on the other hand, was supposedly motivated by ideology and principles. He was descended from the Lucius Junius Brutus, who had overthrown Rome's last king and established the Republic 5 centuries earlier. This family connection was important to his identity. He saw himself as heir to a tradition of defending republican liberty against tyranny. When people wrote graffiti around Rome saying things like "Brutus, are you really Brutus?" or "Brutus, where are you when Rome needs you?" they were appealing to this family legacy. The message was clear: your ancestor saved Rome from tyranny, now it's your turn. Caesar had been good to Brutus. He'd pardoned him after the Civil War, promoted him to high office, given him governorships, and generally treated him as a favoured protégé. Brutus's mother Servilia had been one of Caesar's lovers. There were rumours that Brutus might actually be Caesar's son, though the timeline doesn't really work out. Regardless, Caesar clearly had affection for Brutus and had shown him considerable favour, and Brutus was planning to kill him anyway, because ideology supposedly trumped personal obligation. The thing about Brutus that makes him simultaneously admirable and infuriating is that he genuinely seems to have believed he was doing the right thing. He convinced himself that killing Caesar was a noble act of tyrannicide, defending the Republic against monarchy. He wasn't motivated by personal ambition or revenge, he thought he was serving a higher principle. Which is great in theory, except his higher principle involved stabbing his benefactor to death, so perhaps his moral reasoning could have used some work. The relationship between Cassius and Brutus in organising the conspiracy is interesting. Ancient sources suggest Cassius was the driving force. He wanted Caesar dead and needed someone with moral authority to make the conspiracy seem legitimate. Brutus provided that legitimacy. If Cassius alone had killed Caesar, it would have looked like ambitious murder. But with Brutus involved, descended from the founder of the Republic, the conspiracy could claim to be defending Roman liberty. Brutus was essentially the conspiracy's moral branding, whether he realised it or not. The recruitment process for the conspiracy must have been remarkably delicate. You can't just walk up to someone and say, "Hey, want to commit treason and murder the dictator?" If they refuse, you've just exposed yourself to potential execution. So the conspirators had to feel people out carefully, testing their loyalty to Caesar versus their devotion to Republican ideals, figuring out who might be receptive before making any explicit proposals. This is risky social engineering at its finest, or worst, depending on your perspective. The final conspiracy included about 60 people, which is an insanely large number of people to keep a secret. Think about how hard it is to organise a surprise party without someone accidentally spoiling it. Now imagine organising a political assassination with 60 co-conspirators, any one of whom could expose the entire plot. The fact that they managed to keep it secret until the actual day suggests either remarkable discipline or remarkable luck. Probably both. Many of the conspirators were men Caesar had personally benefited. He'd pardoned them after defeating them in the Civil War. He'd appointed them to positions of authority. He'd given them wealth and status, and now they were planning to murder him. This seems like spectacular ingratitude until you understand the psychology at work. Being pardoned by Caesar, being given offices by Caesar, being elevated by Caesar, all of this reinforced that they owed everything to Caesar personally. They were his clients, his dependents. For men who valued their independence and status as Roman aristocrats, this was humiliating. Caesar's generosity was a constant reminder of their subordinate position. There's a psychological phenomenon where people sometimes resent those who help them, particularly when the help is given in a way that emphasizes the helper's superior position. Caesar didn't just pardon his enemies, he made a show of his clemency, his magnanimity, his willingness to be merciful. This was politically smart but psychologically toxic for the recipients. Every act of clemency was a reminder that Caesar had power over them, that their positions depended on his continued favour. Some people responded with genuine gratitude, others responded with resentment and eventually murderous rage. Take Gaius Trebonius, for example. He'd been one of Caesar's legates in Gaul, had served competently, been rewarded with a consulship. By traditional standards, he should have been grateful and loyal. But Caesar's patronage had limits. Trebonius apparently expected more than he received, or perhaps resented that what he did receive came from Caesar's grace rather than his own merit. He became one of the conspirators and was assigned the specific task of keeping Mark Antony away from the Senate meeting on the day of the assassination. His job was to delay Antony, engage him in conversation, physically prevent him from entering the meeting chamber. It required being able to act normally, to hide his knowledge of the conspiracy, to betray someone who considered him an ally. That takes a particular kind of psychological compartmentalization. Then there's Tullius Cimber, who had the job of actually initiating the attack. He was supposed to approach Caesar with a petition, get close to him, and then grab Caesar's toga as a signal for the other conspirators to begin stabbing. This meant Cimber had to look Caesar in the eye, appear respectful and deferential, and then physically assault him. The psychological preparation required for that specific role, knowing you're about to touch someone you're about to help kill, is worth considering. Cimber wasn't some hired assassin accustomed to violence. He was a politician who'd served in various capacities, who presumably had normal human reactions to violence, who had to override every instinct about not attacking someone in cold blood. Publius Servilius Casca was assigned to strike the first blow after Cimber gave the signal. This is another psychologically demanding role. Being the first to actually stab someone changes the nature of the conspiracy from theoretical to actual. Once Casca struck, there was no going back. Everyone would be complicit in attempted or successful murder. The pressure on Casca must have been immense. And according to the sources, his first strike was poorly aimed, hitting Caesar in the shoulder or neck rather than anywhere immediately fatal. Whether this was due to nervousness, poor positioning, or Caesar's resistance, we don't know. But it meant the conspiracy's carefully planned assassination immediately turned into a chaotic melee. The conspiracy included father-son pairs, brothers, cousins, family members who recruited each other into the plot. This added another layer of psychological complexity. If you recruited your son into a murder conspiracy and it failed, you'd have doomed your entire family. If your brother recruited you and you refused, you'd be creating family conflict that could last generations. The conspiracy spread through family connections partly because trust within families was stronger than among unrelated senators, but also because family bonds created pressure to participate that was hard to resist. Some conspirators were young men barely into their political careers. Gaius Cassius Parmensis was probably in his early 20s when he joined the conspiracy. What convinces someone that young to commit political assassination? Probably idealism combined with peer pressure. Young people are susceptible to absolute thinking. Caesar is a tyrant. Tyrants must be killed, therefore we're heroes for killing him. The nuance and consequence thinking that might give older people pause doesn't always register with idealistic youth. Add in the excitement of being part of something dramatic and important, of being trusted by older, more established men, and you have a recipe for young conspirators who are enthusiastic participants in something they don't fully understand. The conspiracy apparently met multiple times to coordinate their plans. These meetings were risky. 60 people gathering repeatedly would attract attention. They had to find secure locations, ensure no servants or clients overheard discussions, and maintain the fiction that these were just normal social gatherings. The planning meetings themselves would have been fascinating. Who speaks first? How do you debate the details of an assassination? Does someone take notes, or is everything kept oral to avoid written evidence? The practical logistics of organizing a conspiracy this large without modern communication technology or secure meeting spaces must have been nightmarish. There was also the question of what happens after Caesar is dead. This is where the conspiracy's lack of planning becomes most apparent. They devoted enormous energy to the mechanics of killing Caesar, but almost none to the political aftermath. Some conspirators apparently believed that killing Caesar would automatically restore the Republic, that Romans would spontaneously return to traditional governance once the tyrant was removed. This is magical thinking of the highest order. Caesar's power base didn't depend solely on Caesar being alive. His veterans still existed. His political allies still existed. His reforms still existed. Killing one man wasn't going to undo years of structural change. Brutus apparently imagined making a speech after the assassination, explaining their motives and winning popular support through rhetorical brilliance. This suggests someone who fundamentally misunderstood the political situation. The Roman mob wasn't going to be won over by a speech about constitutional principles. They'd benefited from Caesar's policies and would be furious about his murder. Brutus's belief that he could explain the assassination and have people agree he'd done the right thing shows remarkable naivety about human psychology and political reality. The conspiracy also included people with more specific grievances. Some were passed over for offices they thought they deserved. Some had been humiliated in various ways by Caesar's policies. Some simply hated that Rome was being ruled by one man rather than governed through traditional institutions. Each conspirator had their own reasons for wanting Caesar dead, which meant the conspiracy wasn't really unified by shared ideology. It was unified only by shared desire for Caesar's death. This is important because it meant that once Caesar was dead, these people would have no agreed-upon plan for what came next. They knew what they opposed, but not what they supported. The self-deception required for this conspiracy was remarkable. These men convinced themselves they were heroes acting in Rome's best interests. They called themselves liberators, liberatores, defending freedom against tyranny. They saw themselves as the last true patriots in a Rome that had forgotten its values. This narrative was essential because otherwise they'd have to confront that they were planning to commit murder for a mix of personal grievances, political ambition, and ideological rigidity. The defending liberty story was psychologically necessary to make their planned actions morally acceptable to themselves. Groupthink played a massive role here. When you get a group of people who all agree that something must be done, They start reinforcing each other's beliefs and dismissing contrary evidence. Any doubts get suppressed because expressing doubt means going against group consensus. The conspiracy became an echo chamber where everyone confirmed everyone else's belief that killing Caesar was necessary and righteous. Nobody wanted to be the one questioning whether maybe, just maybe, murdering the dictator would lead to civil war and disaster. That would make you look weak, or, worse, disloyal to the cause. There's evidence that some of the conspirators had serious doubts, but went along anyway because the group momentum was too strong. Once you're part of a conspiracy involving 60 people, backing out is difficult. You can't just say, actually, on reflection, I think we shouldn't commit treason and murder. You're already complicit. Your options are to participate or to expose the conspiracy and become a traitor to your co-conspirators. The social and political pressure to continue once you're involved would have been enormous. The conspirators apparently took oaths binding themselves to the plot. This created formal commitment. Backing out meant breaking an oath, which was serious business for Romans who took oath-swearing very seriously. It also meant that everyone was equally guilty. If the conspiracy failed, everyone would be executed together. This shared risk should have created solidarity, though in practice it probably just meant everyone was trapped in a plan they couldn't escape even if they wanted to. Decimus Brutus deserves special mention as possibly the most important conspirator who gets the least attention in popular history. He was one of Caesar's closest associates, had served with distinction in Gaul, was named in Caesar's will as a potential heir if something happened to his primary heirs. Caesar trusted him completely. And Decimus was one of the key conspirators, helping to plan the assassination, and crucially convincing Caesar to come to the Senate on March 15th, when Caesar was planning to stay home based on Calpurnia's dream. Decimus's betrayal was arguably more complete than Brutus's. Brutus had philosophical reasons, however misguided. Decimus was betraying someone who trusted him absolutely, someone who had elevated him to positions of power and wealth, someone who considered him a friend. The ancient sources don't give us much insight into Decimus's psychology. Why would someone in his position turn against Caesar? Perhaps he believed in the Republic. Perhaps he feared Caesar's growing monarchical tendencies. Perhaps he resented being Caesar's subordinate rather than his equal. We don't really know, but his betrayal was particularly devastating to Caesar, which we'll get to when we talk about the assassination itself. The timing of the conspiracy was also carefully calculated. The conspirators knew Caesar was planning to leave Rome in mid-March to lead a campaign against the Parthians. Once he left Rome with his legions, he'd be untouchable, surrounded by loyal soldiers, far from Rome where the Senate had any authority. If they were going to kill him, it had to be before he departed. This created a deadline that added urgency to their planning. It also meant they had to strike in Rome, in a relatively public setting, which added risk but was necessary given the circumstances. The choice of the Senate meeting as the assassination venue was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it was one of the few places where Caesar appeared without a bodyguard, where the conspirators could get close to him, where weapons could be concealed under togas. Symbolically, killing him in the Senate sent a message. This was the Senate asserting its authority over Caesar, the representatives of the Republic striking down a would-be monarch. The location would make their actions seem more legitimate, more like an execution than a murder. There was apparently debate among the conspirators about whether they should also kill Mark Antony, Caesar's close ally and co-consul. Some argued that Antony was too dangerous to leave alive. He'd seek revenge for Caesar's death. Others argued that their action should be focused solely on the tyrant himself, that killing others would make them look like they were conducting a purge rather than a principled act of tyrannicide. Brutus apparently insisted they should only kill Caesar, which would turn out to be a catastrophic error in judgment. Leaving Antony alive gave Caesar's supporters a leader who would effectively use Caesar's death against the conspirators. The conspirators also apparently discussed whether to kill Caesar legally through some kind of trial, but that was quickly recognized as impossible. Caesar controlled enough of the government that any legal proceeding would be a farce. Besides, what exactly would they charge him with? Being too popular? Implementing reforms? Winning too many battles? There was no legal path to removing Caesar, which is why they resorted to assassination. But this also meant they knew they were breaking the law, acting outside the constitution they claimed to be defending. The cognitive dissonance required to believe you're defending rule of law by committing extra-legal murder is impressive. One aspect of the conspiracy that often gets overlooked is the role of peer pressure and social networks. Many of the conspirators were related to each other or connected through marriage, friendship, or political alliance. Once a few key people were committed, it became easier to recruit others from their social circles. If your brother-in-law or political patron was part of the conspiracy, you'd be under pressure to join. Refusing might make you look like a coward or a Caesar loyalist, damaging your reputation among your peers. The conspiracy spread through Roman social networks like a virus, infecting one aristocratic circle after another. The younger conspirators, and there were several in their 20s and 30s, were particularly susceptible to idealistic appeals. They'd been raised on stories about the glorious Republic, about how their ancestors had governed Rome through collective wisdom and shared power. They saw Caesar as destroying everything they'd been taught to value. For young idealists, the conspiracy offered a chance to be heroes, to save Rome, to live up to their ancestors' legacy. That this would actually plunge Rome into chaos and civil war wasn't something they seriously considered. The idealism of youth combined with the certainty of group consensus is a dangerous combination. There were certainly Romans who were approached about joining the conspiracy and refused. We don't know exactly who or how many, because people who refused didn't advertise that fact. It would have made them look suspicious to both sides. But statistically, with 60 conspirators eventually participating, there must have been others who were sounded out and said no. These people faced a difficult choice: expose the conspiracy and risk making enemies of dozens of powerful Romans, or keep quiet and hope the conspirators failed or changed their minds. Most apparently chose silence, which is rational self-preservation, but didn't help Caesar avoid his fate. The conspiracy's success depended on everyone playing their role on the actual day. Specific conspirators were assigned to delay or distract Mark Antony so he couldn't interfere. Others were positioned to surround Caesar when he entered the Senate chamber. Still others were ready to stab him once the attack began. This level of coordination required planning and rehearsal. You can't have 60 people attack one man simultaneously without some organization, or you'd just get in each other's way. The fact that the assassination worked according to plan suggests the conspirators had thought through the logistics carefully, even if they hadn't thought through the political consequences at all. The psychological transformation required to go from being a Roman senator to being willing to commit murder shouldn't be underestimated. These weren't professional killers. They were politicians, some with military experience but most more comfortable giving speeches than wielding weapons. The fact that so many of them were willing to participate in a close-quarters killing, which would be brutal, bloody and personal, suggests how thoroughly they'd convinced themselves this was necessary and righteous. Normal moral barriers against killing had been broken down through months of group reinforcement and ideological justification. In the end, the conspiracy succeeded in its immediate goal. Caesar would die on the Ides of March. But it failed in every other objective. The Republic wasn't restored, monarchy wasn't prevented, the conspirators weren't hailed as heroes. Instead, they'd be hunted down and killed within a few years. Their names would become synonymous with betrayal, and their actions would be cited as examples of political assassination gone wrong for the next 2,000 years. The gap between their self-perception as liberators and their historical legacy as assassins is one of the great ironies of the ancient world. They thought they were saving Rome. They were actually signing its death certificate. If there's one thing ancient historians loved, it was dramatic irony, where the audience knows something terrible is going to happen, but the protagonist doesn't see it coming. And Caesar's march toward the Ides of March gave them plenty to work with. Because Caesar didn't just walk blindly into his assassination. He was warned, repeatedly through multiple channels, in increasingly urgent ways, and he ignored every single warning. Understanding why requires us to look at Roman attitudes toward fate, prophecy, and divine signs, as well as Caesar's own psychology in the final months of his life. The most famous warning came from a soothsayer, a haruspex, someone who practiced divination by reading animal entrails, which is exactly as gross as it sounds, but was taken seriously in Roman religious practice. According to multiple ancient sources, this soothsayer warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month, which was a normal day in the Roman calendar but was about to become the most infamous date in ancient history. The soothsayer apparently made this prediction sometime in late February or early March, giving Caesar about 2 weeks to take precautions. Now, we need to understand that Romans had a complicated relationship with divination and prophecy. They believed in it, sort of. The Roman state maintained official augurs and haruspices who performed divination as part of state religious functions. Before major decisions, especially military campaigns, Roman officials would consult the auspices, looking for signs from the gods about whether their plans were favoured. Finding unfavourable omens could legitimately delay military operations or political actions. This wasn't superstition in the modern sense, it was integrated into Roman governmental procedures. But individual Romans varied widely in how seriously they took these practices. Some were genuinely devout believers who wouldn't make a decision without consulting divine signs. Others viewed the whole thing as political theatre, useful for manipulating public opinion or providing religious justification for decisions made on practical grounds, but not actually predictive. And many fell somewhere in between, unsure whether the gods really communicated through bird flights and sheep livers, but unwilling to risk ignoring potential divine warnings. Caesar seems to have been in the skeptical camp, at least regarding personal prophecies. He'd participated in official state divination because it was expected of him as a political leader, but his private beliefs were probably more rationalist. He was well educated in philosophy, had spent time with Greek intellectuals, and had the kind of practical military mind that trusted planning and logistics more than supernatural signs. When the soothsayer warned him about the Ides of March, Caesar apparently took it seriously enough to remember the warning, but not seriously enough to actually change his behaviour. The story goes that on the morning of March 15th, as Caesar was walking to the Senate meeting where he'd be killed, he encountered the same soothsayer. Caesar supposedly joked, "The Ides of March have come," implying that the prophecy had failed since he was still alive. The soothsayer replied, "Yes, but they have not yet passed," which in hindsight is an excellent comeback, but probably didn't register as urgent warning at the time. This exchange suggests Caesar was aware of the prophecy, remembered it specifically on the day in question, but treated it as something to make jokes about rather than take seriously. We've already covered Calpurnia's dream in earlier chapters, but it fits into this pattern of escalating warnings. Her nightmare about holding Caesar's bleeding corpse was vivid enough and disturbing enough that she begged Caesar not to go to the Senate that day, and initially Caesar agreed. He sent word that he wouldn't attend the meeting. This was a big deal. The Senate was waiting for him, there was important business to conduct, and Caesar was cancelling because of his wife's bad dream. If he'd stuck with that decision, the conspiracy would have failed, at least temporarily. But then Decimus Brutus showed up and changed Caesar's mind through a combination of mockery and appeals to duty. Decimus pointed out that the Senate would look foolish if they'd all assembled for nothing. He suggested that cancelling because of a dream would make Caesar look weak or superstitious. He emphasised that Caesar had important matters to discuss with the Senate. And crucially, he probably invoked Caesar's image as a strong rational leader who didn't let dreams and prophecies dictate his actions. This was exactly the right argument to use on Caesar, appealing to his pride and his self-image as someone above superstitious fears. The effectiveness of Decimus's manipulation here is worth noting. He knew Caesar well enough to understand how to overcome his caution. A direct "you should come to the Senate despite the warning" would have been suspicious. Instead, Decimus used subtle psychological pressure, making Caesar feel like staying home would damage his reputation and make him look foolish. This is manipulator's tradecraft, using someone's own psychology against them, and it worked perfectly. Caesar overrode his wife's pleas and his own initial caution, and went to the Senate where Decimus and the other conspirators were waiting to kill him. But the warnings didn't stop with dreams and soothsayers. There were supposedly numerous strange omens in the days leading up to the assassination. Ancient sources report unusual animal behaviour, strange lights in the sky, disturbing phenomena that Romans would have interpreted as the gods trying to communicate something important. We should be sceptical about some of these reports. Ancient historians had a tendency to retroactively add omens before major events to make the narrative more dramatic. But even if we discount the more fantastical claims, there was clearly an atmosphere of unease in Rome in early March. Plutarch reports that horses Caesar had dedicated to the gods after crossing the Rubicon, symbolic animals that represented his momentous decision to start the civil war, suddenly refused to eat and wept copious tears. This is probably either complete fabrication or massive exaggeration of normal horse behaviour, but it's the kind of omen ancient Romans would have taken seriously. Animals acting strangely was considered a sign that the natural order was disturbed, that the gods were warning about impending disaster. There were also reports of birds behaving unusually. Roman augurs, official priests who practiced divination by observing bird behavior, were trained to interpret flight patterns, feeding habits, and bird calls as divine messages. If the augurs were reporting troubling signs in early March, that would have been taken as official divine communication that something was wrong. The fact that Caesar apparently ignored or dismissed these warnings suggests either skepticism about augury in general, or specific confidence that whatever the gods were warning about didn't apply to him. Pliny the Elder, writing a century later, mentioned a comet or unusual celestial phenomenon around the time of Caesar's assassination. Romans interpreted comets as significant omens, usually of major political changes or the deaths of important people. If there actually was a visible comet in March 44 BC, and this is astronomically possible, though hard to verify, it would have been yet another warning that something momentous and probably bad was about to happen. The fact that Caesar went to the Senate despite a visible comet suggesting divine displeasure would have seemed either admirably courageous or stupidly reckless to his contemporaries, depending on their perspective. The cultural context of these omens is important. Romans weren't just superstitious in the casual modern sense. They had an entire religious and philosophical framework for understanding divine communication. The gods didn't typically speak to humans directly. They sent signs that had to be interpreted. Natural phenomena, animal behavior, dreams, random events, all could be messages if you knew how to read them. Professional priests spent their entire careers learning to interpret these signs. Ignoring clear omens wasn't just foolish, it was potentially impious, suggesting you thought you knew better than the gods. But Romans also had a tension in their belief system between fate and free will. If something was fated to happen, could warnings actually prevent it? Or were the warnings themselves part of fate, serving some other divine purpose? Caesar may have been caught in this philosophical trap. If the gods had fated him to die on the Ides of March, then taking precautions was pointless. Fate would find a way. But if he had free will and the warnings were meant to help him avoid disaster, then ignoring them was choosing his own death. We don't know which Caesar believed, or if he'd even thought through the philosophical implications. Some people responded with genuine gratitude, others responded with resentment and eventually murderous rage. Then there was the written warning that Caesar received on the actual day of his assassination. According to ancient sources, a man named Artemidorus, a Greek teacher who knew some of the conspirators, wrote out details of the plot and tried to hand the document to Caesar as he was entering the meeting. Caesar took the paper but didn't read it immediately, being surrounded by people trying to get his attention. The unread warning was supposedly still in his hand when he was killed. If he'd just paused to read it, the entire conspiracy would have been exposed and history would have gone very differently. This detail is so perfectly tragic it might have been invented by later historians, but it's psychologically plausible. Caesar was powerful and busy. Random people trying to give him documents was probably a daily occurrence. Petitions, requests, letters, all demanding his attention. Having the one document that could have saved his life mixed in with routine correspondence, being unable to distinguish the crucial from the mundane, makes sense in a way that pure tragedy rarely does. Caesar's problem wasn't that no one tried to warn him, it's that he couldn't identify which warnings mattered. There's a broader question here about Caesar's psychology in his final months. Why did he dismiss so many warnings? Several theories exist, and they're not mutually exclusive. First, there's fatalism, the idea that Caesar had come to accept that he might be killed and decided not to live in fear of it. There are sources suggesting Caesar said he'd rather die suddenly than live in constant anxiety about assassination. If true, this suggests someone who had made peace with mortality and decided that living freely was worth the risk of dying violently. Second, there's pride or hubris. Caesar had accomplished everything. He'd conquered Gaul, won the civil war, reformed Rome, reached heights of power that no Roman before him had achieved. Perhaps he'd started believing his own legend, thinking that he was too important, too necessary, too beloved for anyone to successfully kill him. This kind of hubris is common among leaders who've had long strings of success. They start thinking they're invincible because they've been winning for so long that losing becomes psychologically unthinkable. Third, there's exhaustion. Caesar was 55 years old, which was relatively old by Roman standards. He'd spent decades in military campaigns, political battles, constant stress and danger. He was planning another major military campaign against the Parthians. Perhaps he was just tired. Tired of being vigilant, tired of political maneuvering, Tired of the constant pressure of maintaining his position, the warnings required him to be paranoid, to suspect everyone, to treat the Senate meeting as dangerous. Maybe he just didn't have the energy to maintain that level of suspicion anymore. Fourth, there's the political calculation. If Caesar had responded to every warning by increasing security, surrounding himself with bodyguards, treating the Senate as hostile, he would have looked like a tyrant afraid of his own people. Part of his political image was that he was beloved, that he governed with the consent of the Romans, that he didn't need to fear for his safety because he'd earned loyalty through his actions. Taking the warning seriously would have meant admitting that this image was false, that he was actually in danger, that many senators wanted him dead. Perhaps maintaining the image of security was more important to him than actual security. The question of whether Caesar could have stopped the conspiracy if he'd taken the warning seriously is interesting. With 60 conspirators, the plot was vulnerable to exposure. All Caesar needed was for one person to break ranks and reveal the details. If he'd postponed the Senate meeting, increased his security, and started investigating rumors of conspiracy, he might have uncovered enough evidence to prevent the assassination. But doing so would have required treating the Senate as hostile, which would have been politically dangerous in different ways. Caesar was caught between needing to trust the Senate enough to work with them and being suspicious enough to protect himself. There's also the cultural context of how Romans viewed fate and free will. They believed in fate, that certain things were destined to happen and couldn't be avoided. But they also believed in taking action and trying to shape outcomes. This created a philosophical tension. If something is fated, warning about it is pointless because it will happen anyway. But if you have free will, then warnings should be heeded and acted upon. Caesar may have been caught in this philosophical paradox, taking the warnings seriously enough to remember them, but not seriously enough to believe he could change what was fated. The role of Calpurnia in all this is particularly poignant. She had no political power, no vote, no official standing in Roman government. But she had personal influence with Caesar through their marriage. Her dream was a warning, her pleas were a warning, her distress was a warning. And initially Caesar listened to her. He decided to stay home. It took Decimus's manipulation to override her influence. If Caesar had valued his wife's concern over Decimus's appeals to his pride, he'd have lived. The tragedy is that the person who tried hardest to save Caesar, the person who had genuine care for his well-being rather than political calculations, was the one whose advice he ultimately ignored. Looking at all these warnings in sequence, what's striking is how many opportunities Caesar had to avoid his fate. Any one of them, taken seriously, could have saved him. The soothsayer's prophecy could have made him cautious. Calpurnia's dream could have kept him home. The strange omens could have convinced him to postpone. Artemidorus's note could have exposed the conspiracy. He had multiple chances to save himself, and he passed on all of them. This is what makes the story so perfectly tragic in the classical sense. The protagonist's downfall is simultaneously inevitable and preventable, fated and chosen. The warnings also tell us something about Roman culture's relationship with prophecy and divine communication. Despite being relatively sophisticated in many ways, Romans maintained belief systems that we'd consider superstitious. They performed divination before battles, they interpreted bird flights as omens, they believed gods communicated through natural phenomena. But simultaneously, they were practical, rational people who made decisions based on military and political calculations. Caesar embodied this contradiction, sophisticated enough to be skeptical of prophecy, but Roman enough to remember and reference it, proud enough to dismiss warnings, but human enough to initially listen to his wife's fear. In the end, the warnings didn't save Caesar because he chose not to let them save him. Maybe he thought they weren't credible. Maybe he thought he could handle whatever came. Maybe he was just tired of being careful. Or maybe, on some level, he knew what was coming and decided to meet it rather than spend his remaining time in fear. We'll never know exactly what was in Caesar's mind as he walked into the Senate on March 15th. But we know he'd been warned, repeatedly, explicitly, urgently, and he went anyway. That choice, to ignore warning after warning and walk into an ambush, is what transformed Caesar from a historical figure into a tragic hero, whose story resonates across millennia. Before we get to the actual murder, and trust me, we're getting there, we need to talk about where it happened. Because the conspirators didn't just randomly pick the Theatre of Pompey as their assassination venue. The location was simultaneously practical and deeply symbolic, carrying layers of irony that would have been obvious to anyone who knew Roman history. Caesar was killed in a building constructed by his former rival and enemy at the foot of a statue of the man he defeated in civil war. If you're looking for poetic justice or cosmic irony, this is pretty much peak Roman tragedy material. The Theatre of Pompey was one of Rome's architectural marvels, the first permanent stone theatre in the city. Before Pompey built it around 55 BC, Roman theatres had been temporary wooden structures that were erected for specific festivals and then dismantled. This was partly practical. Wood was cheaper and easier to work with, but also partly cultural. There was a persistent belief among traditional Romans that permanent theatres encouraged laziness and moral decay. If people could go watch plays whenever they wanted, rather than just during special religious festivals, they might start prioritising entertainment over work and civic duty. Can't have that, obviously. Better to make theatrical entertainment inconvenient, so Romans remained properly austere and hard-working. Pompey got around this objection through clever architectural manipulation. He didn't build a theatre, that would have been controversial. He built a temple to Venus Victrix at the top of the seating area, and the theatre seating was just, the stairs leading up to the temple. Perfectly legitimate religious architecture, not a theatre at all. The fact that these temple stairs were arranged in a semicircle and happened to be perfect for watching dramatic performances was pure coincidence. This is the kind of creative rule-bending that Romans excelled at, maintaining the letter of tradition while completely violating its spirit. The theatre complex was massive. The theatre itself could seat something like 40,000 people, making it one of the largest entertainment venues in the ancient world. But Pompey didn't stop there. Behind the theatre, he built a huge portico, a covered walkway with columns that connected to a Senate meeting hall, gardens, and various other public spaces. This entire complex took up a substantial chunk of Rome's Campus Martius, the field outside the ancient city walls where military exercises and public gatherings took place. It was a statement of Pompey's wealth, power, and commitment to public works. "Look what I built for Rome," it said. "Look how magnificent I am." The Senate meeting hall, the Curia of Pompey, was where Caesar would be killed. This wasn't the Senate's regular meeting place. The traditional Curia, where the Senate normally met, was under renovation in March 44 BC. So they were using Pompey's meeting hall as a temporary venue, which is ironic in so many ways it's almost painful. Caesar, who had defeated Pompey and essentially ended his political career, was attending a Senate meeting in a building that existed as a monument to Pompey's earlier glory. Every senator present would have been aware of this irony. Some probably found it amusing. The conspirators definitely found it appropriate. The statue of Pompey inside the hall made the symbolism even more pointed. After Pompey's death in Egypt, murdered on a beach by people who thought they were doing Caesar a favour, his widow had commissioned a statue of him that was placed in his theatre complex. This statue reportedly stood in the Curia, where the Senate was meeting on March 15th. So Caesar was killed at the base of a statue of his greatest rival, the man whose defeat had allowed Caesar to become supreme leader of Rome. The conspirators couldn't have chosen a more symbolically loaded location if they'd tried. Actually, they definitely did try, which makes it even more pointed. The choice of location was also practical, not just symbolic. The Curia of Pompey was essentially a semi-public space. It was a Senate meeting hall, so senators could enter freely without suspicion. But it was also somewhat isolated from Caesar's supporters. Caesar's veterans and the urban mob that loved him couldn't easily access the area during a Senate session. Security around Senate meetings was typically light because senators were supposed to be Rome's most respectable citizens, not potential assassins. Though clearly someone should have reconsidered that assumption. The physical layout of the hall also favoured the conspirators. Ancient sources describe it as a relatively large chamber, where senators could move around somewhat freely. This meant the conspirators could position themselves strategically without it looking suspicious. They could surround Caesar, cut off potential escape routes, and ensure that no one could interfere once the attack began. In a more confined space or a more public venue, pulling off an assassination involving this many attackers would have been nearly impossible. The portico and gardens surrounding the Curia provided convenient locations for conspirators to gather before the meeting without attracting attention. They could wait in the gardens, pretend to be discussing politics in the portico, and then file into the Senate meeting without anyone thinking it was unusual that so many senators were arriving around the same time. If they'd tried to stage the assassination somewhere without these convenient gathering spaces, coordination would have been much more difficult. There's also the question of weapons. Senators wore togas to meetings, and togas are essentially large pieces of cloth draped around the body in specific ways. They're not exactly designed for concealing weapons, but with enough fabric and careful arrangement, you could hide a dagger. The fact that the meeting was taking place in what was technically a theatre complex rather than a government building might have made security even more relaxed than usual. Nobody was checking senators for weapons as they entered, which turned out to be a catastrophic security failure, but was probably standard practice for Senate meetings. The acoustics of the space might have played a role too, though ancient sources don't specifically mention this. Theatres are designed to project sound and voice. The Curia, being part of a theatre complex, might have had better acoustics than a typical meeting hall. This would have been useful for the conspirators if they planned to make speeches after the assassination, explaining their actions to whoever was present. Brutus apparently did try to speak after Caesar's death, though by that point the acoustics were the least of his problems, given that everyone present was running away in panic. The symbolism of killing Caesar in Pompey's theatre extended beyond just the personal rivalry between Caesar and Pompey. Pompey had represented the old Republican order, the traditional way of doing things, the idea that Rome could be governed through Senate consensus and shared power among the aristocracy. He'd failed, been defeated by Caesar, and died in exile. But his building remained, a physical reminder that the old order had existed and had built impressive monuments. Killing Caesar in Pompey's space was like saying, the old order isn't dead, it's just been waiting for the right moment to strike back. The conspirators apparently discussed the symbolism explicitly when choosing their assassination venue. They wanted the location to send a message. This wasn't just murder, it was tyrannicide, the righteous killing of a tyrant in defense of the Republic. Doing it in a Senate meeting hall emphasized that this was the Senate's judgment of Caesar. Doing it in Pompey's theatre connected their action to the Republican faction that had opposed Caesar in the Civil War. The location was propaganda, making their act seem like historical justice rather than political assassination. The irony that Caesar would die in a building constructed by a man he defeated wasn't lost on anyone. Romans loved this kind of poetic symmetry. It fit into their understanding of fate and divine justice. Caesar had risen by defeating Pompey. Now Caesar would fall in Pompey's shadow literally at the foot of his statue. The message was that no one escapes the wheel of fortune, that pride comes before a fall, that even the most successful leader is ultimately subject to powers beyond their control. This is the kind of dramatic irony that Roman philosophers and historians lived for. But here's the darker irony that the conspirators might not have fully appreciated. By killing Caesar in Pompey's theatre, they were connecting Caesar's death to the broader failure of the Republican cause that Pompey had represented. Pompey had lost the Civil War. The Republican faction had been defeated. Killing Caesar in Pompey's building wasn't really a victory for republicanism. It was more like the last gasp of a political movement that had already lost. They were fighting in the ruins of their own failed ideology, which is poetic but not exactly encouraging for their chances of success. The physical space also affected how the assassination played out. The Curia wasn't designed for violence, it was designed for deliberation and speech-giving. When the attack began, there weren't convenient weapons or defensive positions. Caesar couldn't barricade himself anywhere. The senators who weren't part of the conspiracy couldn't easily help him without risking getting stabbed themselves in the chaos. The space that should have been safe for political discussion became a killing floor, which violated every expectation about how Senate meetings were supposed to function. After Caesar's death, the theatre of Pompey took on new symbolic meaning. It became the place where the dictator fell, where the conspirators struck their blow for liberty, where Roman politics turned violent in an unprecedented way. But it was still Pompey's theatre, still bearing his name, still a monument to a man who'd tried and failed to stop Caesar through conventional military means. The building outlasted both of them, remaining as a physical reminder of their rivalry and its bloody conclusion. In the centuries after Caesar's assassination, the theatre of Pompey continued to be used for its original purposes: theatrical performances, public gatherings, gladiatorial games. Life went on. But it also became a historical landmark, a place where tour guides would point out, this is where Caesar died. The Curia, where the actual assassination occurred, was eventually closed and sealed, considered cursed, or too symbolically heavy to continue using as a meeting space. You can still see ruins of the theatre complex in Rome today, though much of it has been built over by medieval and modern structures. The space where Caesar bled out is now partially occupied by a restaurant, which is either appropriately Roman in its practical repurposing of historical sites, or somewhat macabre depending on your perspective. The location choice reveals something important about the conspirators' mindset. They were thinking symbolically, dramatically, historically. They wanted their act to resonate, to carry meaning beyond just the physical death of one man. They succeeded in that. Caesar's assassination in Pompey's theatre is one of the most famous murders in history, recognizable across cultures and centuries. But they failed to understand that symbolic gestures don't change political realities. Killing Caesar in a meaningful location made for great theatre, which is appropriate given the venue. But it didn't restore the Republic, didn't win popular support, and didn't prevent the rise of the Empire. Sometimes the location tells the story, but it doesn't change the ending. So we've finally arrived at the Ides of March, the day that would transform from a normal date on the Roman calendar into one of history's most infamous moments. Everything we've been building toward, Caesar's power, the conspiracy's planning, the warnings ignored, the symbolic location chosen, it all comes together on this one morning in Rome. And what's striking when you look at the actual events is how close Caesar came to surviving, how many small decisions and random moments determined whether he'd live or die. This isn't fate operating with perfect precision. This is chaos barely held together by conspiratorial coordination. Caesar woke up that morning in his house with Calpurnia, who we know had that nightmare about holding his corpse. The sources differ on exactly what happened during their morning conversation, but the consensus is that Calpurnia was genuinely distressed and begged Caesar not to go to the Senate. This is remarkable in itself. Roman women weren't supposed to interfere in their husbands' political affairs. That Calpurnia felt strongly enough to violate that norm suggests she was seriously frightened, whether by her dream or by some intuition that something was wrong. Caesar's initial response was apparently to agree with her. He sent a message to Mark Antony saying he wouldn't be attending the Senate meeting. If he'd stuck with that decision, everything changes. The conspiracy would have been postponed, at minimum. Caesar would have left Rome a few days later for his Parthian campaign, surrounded by loyal legions. The conspirators would have lost their window of opportunity. But Caesar didn't stick with his decision, and that's where Decimus Brutus enters the picture. Decimus showed up at Caesar's house, and remember, Decimus was one of Caesar's closest friends, someone Caesar trusted completely, who happened to be one of the chief conspirators planning to murder him in about an hour. Decimus found Caesar still at home and asked why he wasn't at the Senate meeting. Caesar explained about Calpurnia's dream and his decision to stay home. And Decimus, knowing that dozens of conspirators were waiting at the Curia to commit murder, had to convince Caesar to change his mind without revealing anything about the plot. The manipulation Decimus used is worth analysing because it's masterful and evil in equal measure. He didn't argue that Calpurnia was wrong or that the dream was meaningless. Instead, he appealed to Caesar's pride and political image. The Senate was waiting for him. They had important business to discuss. If Caesar didn't show up because of a dream, he'd look weak, superstitious, controlled by his wife's fears. Was Caesar really going to let a nightmare prevent him from attending a Senate meeting? This was psychological manipulation of the highest order, using Caesar's own self-image against him. Decimus also apparently mentioned that there was going to be a proposal to formally grant Caesar kingship over Rome's eastern provinces, which was a lie but a plausible one. Caesar had been accumulating honours and titles, and offering him a kingdom in the east while avoiding the politically toxic title of king in Rome itself was exactly the kind of compromise the Senate might propose. This gave Caesar a practical political reason to attend beyond just not looking weak. There might be actual business he needed to handle. Whether Decimus invented this on the spot or it was a prepared lie, we don't know, but it worked. Caesar changed his mind and decided to go to the Senate. This is the moment where fate could have been avoided, where one person's choice determined everything that followed. If Caesar had said, "No, I'm staying home," Decimus had no way to force him to leave. But Caesar chose his political image over his safety, chose not to look weak over listening to his wife's fears, chose to attend a Senate meeting that would turn into his execution. The walk from Caesar's house to the theatre of Pompey would have taken perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. Caesar was carried in a litter, basically a portable couch carried by slaves, which was standard for important Romans who didn't want to walk through the crowded streets. The sources describe crowds gathering to see him, people approaching with petitions and requests, the normal chaos of Roman public life. Somewhere in that crowd was Artemidorus, clutching his written warning about the conspiracy, trying to get close enough to give it to Caesar. The story goes that Artemidorus managed to hand his note to Caesar, possibly even telling him it was urgent and personal. Caesar took it but didn't read it immediately because he was surrounded by people all trying to get his attention. The note was still in his hand, unread, when he entered the Curia. This detail is almost too perfectly tragic to be true, but it's attested in multiple sources. Caesar literally had the information that could have saved his life, written down, in his possession, and never read it. This is the kind of dramatic irony that Shakespeare would later run with, and you can see why. It's devastatingly effective as storytelling. Caesar arrived at the Curia around midday, which was later than the Senate typically met, but still within normal range. The conspirators had been waiting, probably for hours, not knowing if Caesar would actually show up. The tension among them must have been incredible. They'd committed to treason and murder, but their target had to voluntarily walk into their trap. If Caesar had postponed, or if he'd brought bodyguards, or if he'd changed the meeting location, their entire plan would have failed. And Caesar was known for changing plans at the last minute. They didn't know until he actually appeared that the assassination was going to happen. Mark Antony was with Caesar as he approached the Curia, which was a problem for the conspirators. Antony was Caesar's co-consul, physically strong, a military veteran, and absolutely loyal to Caesar. If Antony was in the room when the attack began, he might fight back, might protect Caesar, might alert Caesar's guards outside. So Trebonius, one of the conspirators, intercepted Antony at the entrance. He engaged him in conversation, physically steered him away from the Curia entrance, delayed him with questions and discussion. Antony, who had no idea he was being manipulated, went along with this. When the assassination happened, Antony was literally outside the building, close enough to hear the commotion but unable to intervene. Trebonius's assignment to delay Antony was perfectly executed. Caesar entered the Curia and took his seat. The senators who weren't part of the conspiracy didn't know what was about to happen. The conspirators were scattered throughout the chamber, trying to look normal, probably experiencing tremendous anxiety about what they were about to do. The meeting was supposed to proceed normally at first, with regular business being discussed before the attack began. This meant everyone had to pretend everything was fine while knowing murder was minutes away. The signal for the attack was Tullius Cimber approaching Caesar with a petition. This was normal. Senators frequently approached Caesar during meetings to make requests or ask for favours. Cimber's petition was supposedly about his brother who had been exiled and needed clemency. Caesar began to respond to the petition, at which point Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his shoulders. This was the prearranged signal. The attack was beginning. Publius Casca, positioned behind Caesar, struck the first blow. He aimed for Caesar's neck or shoulder with his dagger, but either his aim was off or Caesar moved at the wrong moment, because the blow wasn't immediately fatal. Caesar supposedly cried out in pain and tried to defend himself. He grabbed Casca's arm. Ancient sources specify that he stabbed Casca's arm with his stylus, which is the metal pen used for writing on wax tablets. This is a beautifully Roman detail. Even while being assassinated, Caesar fought back with the nearest weapon available, which happened to be a writing implement. Not effective, but points for trying. Once Casca struck, the other conspirators rushed forward. What had been planned as a quick, efficient assassination immediately turned into a chaotic melee. Roughly 60 men trying to stab one person in an enclosed space is not an organised process. It's a panicked scramble. The conspirators were getting in each other's way, accidentally stabbing each other in the confusion, turning what was supposed to be a precise political execution into a mob attack that looked more like a street brawl than a dignified act of tyrannicide. Caesar tried to fight back initially, but he was outnumbered by dozens of armed men, many of whom he'd considered friends or allies. As the daggers kept coming, as the blood started flowing, he apparently gave up trying to resist. The sources describe him pulling his toga over his head, which some historians interpret as trying to die with dignity, maintaining his composure even as he was being murdered. Others suggest he was just trying to protect his face from the knife blows. Either way, the symbolic image is powerful. Caesar facing death while covering his head, unable to see his killers, dying while literally blinded by his own garment. The famous last words, et tu, Brute, might not have been said. Shakespeare made them immortal, but the ancient sources are mixed. Plutarch claims Caesar said, "You too, child," to Brutus in Greek, while other sources say Caesar died in silence. The truth is, we'll never know exactly what Caesar said in his final moments, if anything. But the idea of Caesar recognizing Brutus among his attackers, feeling betrayed by someone he'd favoured, makes for compelling drama whether or not it actually happened. What seems clear is that seeing Brutus with a dagger, actively participating in the murder, hit Caesar harder than the physical wounds. The emotional betrayal hurt more than the knives. The actual assassination probably took only a minute or two, though it must have felt longer to everyone involved. Caesar received 23 stab wounds, though the sources differ on exactly how many. Of these, only 1 or 2 were actually fatal. Most of the blows were shallow cuts or non-lethal wounds. The autopsy later determined, yes, Romans did autopsies, or at least medical examinations of important bodies, that Caesar likely died from a single wound to the chest that punctured his heart, or a major blood vessel. All the other stabs were essentially superfluous, the result of multiple attackers all trying to participate in the killing. Caesar collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue. The symbolism that the conspirators had carefully arranged became literal reality. Caesar bleeding out at the feet of his former rival's image. Whether Caesar noticed this irony or cared about it in his final moments is impossible to know. He was probably more focused on the fact that he was dying, surrounded by men he'd trusted, in a pool of his own blood, on the floor of a Senate meeting. Not exactly the dignified death a Roman general would have preferred. The senators who weren't part of the conspiracy panicked and fled. This wasn't the reaction the conspirators had planned for. They'd apparently expected the Senate to applaud their action, to recognize them as liberators, to celebrate Caesar's death as the restoration of freedom. Instead, everyone ran. Some senators escaped through windows. Others pushed through the doors in a terrified mob. The Curia cleared out in minutes, leaving just the conspirators standing over Caesar's corpse, covered in blood, holding their daggers, slowly realizing that this hadn't gone according to plan. Brutus supposedly tried to give a speech, explaining their actions, justifying the assassination as necessary for Rome's liberty. But there was no one left to hear it. The senators had fled. The crowd outside was confused and frightened. News was spreading throughout Rome that Caesar had been murdered in the Senate, but details were scarce and rumours were flying. Were the conspirators planning to kill Caesar's supporters too? Was this a coup? Was Rome under attack? Nobody knew, and in the absence of information, panic spread. The conspirators made their way out of the Curia and into the streets, still carrying their bloody daggers, supposedly shouting about liberty and freedom. This is what they'd imagined, a triumphant march through Rome being cheered as heroes. Instead, they were met with shocked silence or hostile crowds. People weren't celebrating Caesar's death. They were mourning it or confused by it or frightened of what it meant. The conspirators retreated to the Capitoline Hill, where they could defend themselves if attacked, and tried to figure out what to do next. Meanwhile, Mark Antony had fled to his house and barricaded himself inside, expecting that he might be next on the conspirators' hit list. Other Caesar supporters did the same. Rome went into a kind of shocked lockdown, with no one knowing what would happen next, whether more violence was coming, whether the Republic had been saved, or whether civil war had just begun. Spoiler alert, it was the civil war option. Caesar's body lay in the Curia for hours before anyone dared to retrieve it. Eventually 3 slaves carried him home on a litter, his toga covering him, but unable to hide the multiple stab wounds. The image of Caesar's body being carried through the streets of Rome, obviously murdered, was its own form of political propaganda. People could see with their own eyes that their leader had been killed, stabbed to death by senators, murdered in what was supposed to be a safe political space. The conspirators had wanted to make a statement with their assassination. They definitely made a statement, just not the one they'd intended. If the conspirators thought killing Caesar was the hard part, they were about to discover they'd catastrophically misunderstood the situation. Because while they'd successfully murdered the man, they'd failed to account for what would happen afterward. And what happened afterward was Mark Antony, who was about to demonstrate that he understood political theatre and mass psychology better than all 60 conspirators combined. Caesar's funeral would become the moment when public opinion turned decisively against the assassins, when the people of Rome made clear they considered Caesar a hero and his killers criminals. And the architect of this reversal was Antony, giving what might be the most effective political speech in ancient history. Let's set the scene. After the assassination, Rome was in chaos. The conspirators had retreated to the Capitoline Hill. Caesar's body had been returned to his house. Mark Antony and other Caesar supporters were trying to figure out what to do, and crucially, no one was sure who held actual power. The conspirators had killed Caesar but hadn't seized control of the government. They'd apparently expected that killing the tyrant would automatically restore normal republican government, which shows a touching faith in institutional inertia, but misses the point that institutions need people to operate them, and most of those people were terrified or confused or both. The day after the assassination, there was a tense Senate meeting where both sides tried to figure out how to proceed without triggering civil war. The conspirators wanted amnesty, recognition that they'd acted in Rome's interest and shouldn't be prosecuted for murder. Caesar's supporters wanted revenge but didn't yet have the military power to seize it. The compromise reached was bizarre but very Roman. The assassins would receive amnesty and Caesar's acts and appointments would remain valid. Essentially, they pretended that Caesar's murder was regrettable but not criminal, while also acknowledging that overturning everything Caesar had done would be politically impossible. This satisfied nobody, but prevented immediate violence. But then came the question of Caesar's funeral. Would he receive a public funeral with honours, or would his body be disposed of quietly to avoid inflaming passions? The Senate, probably against its better judgment, agreed to a public funeral. This decision would prove catastrophic for the conspirators, because it gave Antony a platform and an audience, and Antony was about to show exactly why Caesar had valued him as an ally. The funeral was held a few days after the assassination, giving time for preparations and for tensions to build. Romans loved elaborate funerals for important people. They were part religious ceremony, part public spectacle, part political statement. Caesar's funeral would be all three cranked up to maximum intensity. The body was displayed in the Forum on a platform where everyone could see it. The toga Caesar had been wearing, torn and bloodstained, was hung up as well, serving as visual evidence of the violence done to him. This wasn't subtle. It was designed to provoke an emotional response. Mark Antony had been given permission to deliver the funeral oration, which was traditional for important Romans. What wasn't traditional was what Antony did with that opportunity. He stood before the assembled crowd, thousands of Romans packed into the Forum to pay respects to Caesar, and delivered a speech that was simultaneously a eulogy, a political manifesto, and a masterclass in manipulating public emotion. We don't have an exact transcript of Antony's speech, which is unfortunate because it would be fascinating to see exactly what he said. What we have are reconstructions by ancient historians, particularly Plutarch and Appian, who are writing decades or centuries later based on earlier sources. Shakespeare's version in Julius Caesar, the famous Friends Romans countryman speech, is brilliant literature but probably bears limited resemblance to what Antony actually said. Still, the general strategy is clear from all the sources, and it's devastatingly effective. Antony started by praising Caesar's accomplishments. He listed Caesar's victories, his conquests, his generosity to the Roman people, his clemency toward his enemies. This wasn't controversial. Even Caesar's enemies acknowledged he'd achieved remarkable things. But Antony wasn't just listing facts. He was reminding the audience of what they'd lost. Every achievement mentioned was something Rome had benefited from. Every act of generosity was something that had helped ordinary Romans. The subtext was clear. This man who did all this for you has been murdered. Then Antony moved to Caesar's will. Caesar had left his gardens to the people of Rome as a public park, and had bequeathed 300 sesterces to every Roman citizen. This was a substantial sum, several months' wages for a labourer. Antony read this out loud to the crowd, letting them understand that Caesar had been planning to give them money, that he'd cared enough about ordinary Romans to remember them in his will. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. This wasn't an abstract political figure. This was someone who had been going to give them actual, tangible benefits, and he'd been murdered before he could do it. But Antony's master stroke was using Caesar's toga as a prop. He picked up the blood-stained garment and held it up for the crowd to see. He pointed to the tears in the fabric, showing where the daggers had struck. According to some sources, he even pointed to specific tears and said, "This is where Casca struck him. This is where Brutus stabbed him," though that might be dramatic embellishment by later historians. Whether he named specific conspirators or not, the effect was the same. The abstract concept of Caesar being assassinated became concrete and visceral. Here was the actual toga, torn and stained with blood. Here was physical proof of violence done to a man the crowd had loved. Antony also apparently displayed a wax model of Caesar's body showing all 23 stab wounds. Romans used these anatomical models in legal cases to demonstrate injuries, so this wasn't unprecedented, but using it at a funeral was brilliant and manipulative. The crowd could see exactly how Caesar had died. Surrounded, stabbed repeatedly, unable to defend himself. It transformed the assassination from a political act into a brutal murder, from tyrannicide into a gang attack on a defenseless man. The crowd's reaction built throughout Antony's speech. They started weeping at the mention of Caesar's generosity. They gasped when they saw the torn toga. They grew angry as the wounds were described. By the time Antony finished speaking, the mob was ready for violence, and Antony, who understood mob psychology perfectly, had carefully avoided directly calling for violence. He hadn't said, "Go kill the assassins." He just presented information and let the crowd reach their own conclusions. Except the conclusions were entirely predictable and exactly what Antony wanted. The crowd's reaction was immediate and chaotic. They grabbed the funeral bier, the platform Caesar's body was displayed on, and someone suggested burning it right there in the forum rather than taking it to a proper cremation site outside the city. This was illegal. Cremations weren't supposed to happen inside Rome's city limits, but the mob was past caring about legalities. They started ripping apart furniture, benches, anything wooden they could find, building an impromptu funeral pyre in the forum. They cremated Caesar's body right there, in the heart of Rome, surrounded by the Senate buildings and temples that represented the government that had killed him. But the crowd didn't stop with the funeral. They went looking for the conspirators. Mobs spread through Rome hunting for anyone involved in the assassination. The conspirators, who had been hoping that Romans would hail them as liberators, found themselves targets of popular rage. They were hiding in their houses, afraid to show their faces while mobs tried to break down their doors. Some accounts say the mob found a poet named Helvius Cinna, confused him with one of the conspirators who had a similar name, and literally tore him apart in the streets. Whether this specific incident happened or not, the message was clear. Rome loved Caesar, and anyone who had harmed him was in danger. The conspirators fled Rome within days. Brutus, Cassius, and the others left for provinces where they could raise armies, already preparing for the civil war they'd been trying to prevent. Their dream of restoring the Republic had lasted less than a week. Caesar's funeral had made clear that the Roman people didn't want the Republic restored if it meant losing Caesar's policies and benefits. Antony's speech had transformed Caesar from a controversial dictator into a martyred hero, and his assassins from liberators into murderers. The contrast between what the conspirators planned and what actually happened is almost comical in its completeness. They'd planned to kill Caesar and be cheered as heroes. Instead, they killed Caesar and had to flee for their lives from angry mobs. They'd planned to restore republican government. Instead, they triggered another civil war that would ultimately result in monarchy. They'd planned to erase Caesar's influence. Instead, they'd made him a martyr whose memory would be more powerful than his living presence ever was. Antony's funeral speech demonstrated something the conspirators had failed to understand, that legitimacy in Roman politics was increasingly coming from popular support rather than traditional institutional authority. The Senate could declare the assassination legal, but the people could declare it murder. And when those two things conflicted, popular opinion was proving stronger than senatorial decree. This shift had been happening throughout Caesar's career, as he'd built support among ordinary Romans while alienating the Senate. His death simply made the shift explicit and irreversible. The funeral also created a new political dynamic. Before Caesar's death, the conflict was between Caesar and the Senate. After his death, the conflict was between Caesar's supporters and his assassins, with Caesar himself transformed into a symbol that both sides could invoke, but neither could fully control. Caesar dead was simultaneously more and less powerful than Caesar alive, more powerful as a symbol and rallying point, less powerful in that he couldn't actually direct events or make decisions. So after all of this, the military genius, the economic reforms, the propaganda machine, the broken republic, the conspiracy, the ignored warnings, the symbolic assassination location, the chaotic murder, the transformative funeral, what did it all actually accomplish? What were the consequences of stabbing Julius Caesar 23 times in a Senate meeting? The answer is complicated, ironic, and deeply tragic depending on your perspective. The conspirators thought they were saving the Republic. They actually delivered its death blow and guaranteed the rise of the empire they'd been trying to prevent. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Rome had no clear leader. The conspirators had fled. Mark Antony initially seemed like he might seize power, but he didn't have the military strength to do so unilaterally. Then a name emerged that most Romans, including probably most of the conspirators, hadn't seriously considered: Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew, who Caesar had posthumously adopted as his son and heir in his will. This teenager, who had no military experience, no political track record, and no obvious qualifications beyond being Caesar's designated successor, would eventually become the first Roman emperor. If you'd predicted that outcome in March 44 BC, everyone would have thought you were insane. But Octavian had several advantages that weren't immediately obvious. First, he carried Caesar's name. Officially, he became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus after the adoption, which meant he could claim to be Caesar's son. Second, he inherited Caesar's wealth, which was substantial enough to raise armies. Third, and most importantly, he inherited Caesar's veteran soldiers' loyalty. Those men had fought for Caesar for years, had been promised land and money by Caesar, and were furious that their general had been murdered. When someone showed up claiming to be Caesar's son and promising to avenge his death, they signed up enthusiastically. The civil war that followed Caesar's assassination lasted about 15 years and killed hundreds of thousands of people, maybe more. This is the consequence the conspirators apparently never seriously considered. When you murder the most powerful person in a large polity without having a clear succession plan or sufficient military force to maintain control, violence follows. Different factions fought for supremacy. The assassins led by Brutus and Cassius, Antony, Octavian, and various others who saw opportunity in the chaos. The conspirators themselves mostly died badly. Cassius committed suicide after the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, where he and Brutus were defeated by the combined forces of Antony and Octavian. Brutus followed shortly after with his own suicide. The irony is rich. They'd killed Caesar claiming to defend Roman liberty, and they died as defeated generals in a civil war they'd triggered, with Rome further from republican government than when they'd started. Decimus Brutus, who'd manipulated Caesar into attending the fatal Senate meeting, was betrayed and killed by a local Gallic chief in 43 BC. Most of the other conspirators met similar fates: executed, defeated in battle, or forced to suicide. None lived to see anything approaching the restored republic they'd imagined. Mark Antony, who'd seemed like the likely winner after Caesar's funeral, eventually lost to Octavian in another civil war. The famous alliance with Cleopatra, Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, ended with both of them dead by suicide in Egypt after their defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Antony had tried to position himself as Caesar's true successor, but Octavian had the advantage of actually being Caesar's adopted son. In the contest between Caesar's friend and Caesar's heir, the heir won. By 27 BC, Octavian had eliminated all rivals and held supreme power over Rome. This is when he did something clever that the conspirators would have found infuriating if they'd been alive to see it. He didn't declare himself dictator or king. Those titles were toxic after Caesar. Instead, he claimed to be restoring the Republic. He gave back powers to the Senate, held regular elections, maintained republican forms. But he kept for himself the title Augustus, meaning roughly revered one. Permanent military command over most Roman provinces, control of Egypt's wealth, and numerous other powers that made him effectively a monarch in everything but name. He'd created a system where Rome looked like a republic but functioned as a monarchy, with himself as the monarch. This was the system that would govern Rome for the next 500 years. The Roman Empire, ruled by emperors who claimed descent from or adoption by Augustus, who in turn claimed descent from Caesar, became the dominant power in Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. The republic the conspirators had tried to save was thoroughly dead, but Romans could pretend it still existed because Augustus had carefully preserved its forms while gutting its substance. It was the ultimate victory of image over reality, which seems appropriate given Caesar's mastery of propaganda. Caesar himself was formally deified, declared a god, by decree of the Senate. This is stunning when you think about it. The same institution whose members had stabbed him to death officially proclaimed him divine. The Temple of Divus Julius was built in the Forum, on the spot where his body had been cremated. Every subsequent emperor would claim connection to the divine Julius Caesar, using his name and his legacy to legitimize their own rule. The man the conspirators had killed to prevent monarchy became the founding figure of Rome's imperial dynasty. The transformation of Caesar from controversial dictator to divine figure and cultural icon happened quickly. Within a generation, no one seriously questioned that Caesar had been great and that his assassination had been a tragedy. The conspirators, who'd called themselves liberators, were remembered as traitors and murderers. Brutus, who'd believed he was defending republican values, became the archetypical betrayer. Dante would later place him in the lowest circle of hell, along with Judas Iscariot. The narrative had completely reversed from what the conspirators had intended. Caesar's military and political innovations became standard practice in the empire. The professional army personally loyal to the emperor, the use of propaganda and public entertainment to build popular support, the concentration of power in one person, all of this came directly from Caesar's playbook. Augustus and his successors built on Caesar's foundation rather than repudiating it. In trying to kill Caesar's influence, the conspirators had actually ensured it would be institutionalized and made permanent. The broader lesson about political assassination is worth noting. Killing a leader doesn't solve the systemic problems that gave them power. If anything, it often makes those problems worse by creating succession crises and civil wars. The conspirators thought Caesar was the problem. Actually, Caesar was the symptom of a republic that couldn't govern an empire, of institutions that had stopped functioning effectively, of a political system that needed fundamental reform. Killing Caesar didn't fix any of those underlying issues. It just removed the one person who'd figured out how to govern despite them. There's a deeper irony about the conspirators' failure. They acted in defense of liberty, but their action led directly to centuries of autocratic rule. They claimed to serve the Republic, but they destroyed it more completely than Caesar ever had. They wanted to prevent one man from having absolute power, but they created a system where absolute power became institutionalized. Every goal they had was not just unmet, but reversed. This is political failure on a scale that's almost impressive. Modern historians still debate whether Caesar intended to make himself king or whether he was planning to restore some form of republican government after his military campaigns. We'll never know because the conspirators didn't give him a chance to reveal his intentions. But what's clear is that killing him guaranteed the outcome they feared. If there was any possibility of restoring balanced republican government, the assassination destroyed it. The conspirators forced Rome to choose between chaos and autocracy, and Rome chose autocracy. You can't blame them for that choice. Octavian Augustus brought peace after decades of civil war. But you can blame the conspirators for creating the situation where that was the only viable choice. Caesar's name became a title, Kaiser, Tsar, all derived from Caesar. His month of July still marks our calendars. His commentaries are still read by students learning Latin. His crossing of the Rubicon is still a metaphor for passing a point of no return. His assassination is still the archetypical political murder. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about him, still analysing his life and death, still trying to understand what it all meant. The conspirators wanted to erase Caesar's influence. Instead, they made him immortal. The true legacy of the Ides of March isn't Caesar's death. It's the transformation of Rome from republic to empire, the demonstration that political systems can't be preserved through violence, the lesson that killing one person doesn't solve. Institutional problems. These lessons were expensive, paid for with decades of civil war and hundreds of thousands of lives. Whether anyone actually learned from them is questionable. Political assassinations kept happening throughout history, usually with the same result: chaos, civil war, unintended consequences, and the opposite of what the assassins intended. So what should we take away from this whole story? Maybe it's that successful political change requires building new institutions, not just destroying old leaders. Maybe it's that popular legitimacy matters more than traditional authority when the two conflict. Maybe it's that reforms delayed become revolutions enforced. Or maybe it's just that when 60 senators decide to murder someone in a government building, they should probably have a better plan for what happens next than, hopefully everyone will agree we're heroes. The conspirators thought they were ending. A story. The story of Caesar's rise to power, his transformation of Rome, his threat to republican government. They were actually just beginning a new story. The story of the Roman Empire, of autocratic rule justified by Caesar's legacy, of a political system that would shape Western civilization for centuries. They killed the man but created the myth. They prevented Caesar from ruling but ensured his name would become synonymous with absolute power. They acted in defense of the past but guaranteed it could never return. Caesar's assassination was meant to be the salvation of the Republic. It became the final proof that the Republic was already dead, had been dead for years, and that killing someone couldn't resurrect it. The conspirators wrote themselves into history, but as villains rather than heroes, as cautionary examples rather than inspirational figures. Caesar won his civil war even after he was dead, because his enemy's victory turned into his greatest defeat. That's the final irony of the Ides of March. In trying to kill Caesar, they only made him stronger. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through one of history's most famous murders and its spectacular backfire. From Caesar's military genius to his economic reforms, from his propaganda machine to the conspiracy against him, from the ignored warnings to the chaotic assassination itself, and finally to the funeral that changed everything and the empire that rose from blood, we've covered a story that's been told for 2 millennia and still resonates today. I hope this has given you a new perspective on events you might have thought you knew, helped you understand the human psychology and political dynamics behind the ancient drama, and maybe even provided some accidentally relevant commentary on how power, institutions, and political change work regardless of the century. History doesn't repeat, but it definitely has some favourite themes it keeps coming back to. So from ancient Rome to wherever you're listening right now, thank you for spending this time exploring one of history's greatest tragedies with me. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of conspiracy and bad political decisions. Good night, everyone, and sweet dreams.